"Do you really think a black maid like you can teach $1 million kid how to speak?" snarled Officer Sloan during the lavish party, beneath the blazing chandelier lights, as every guest fell silent. In that instant, Noah, the autistic boy, spoke clearly in Spanish, leaving the entire room stunned. The shock shattered the arrogance, forcing Clarissa Hale to confront the truth. The one they all dismissed was the very person who had unlocked her son's mind. If you believe that even a small voice can shake power to its core, keep watching until the end to witness what no one dared imagine. The Hale mansion lit up the night like a palace, flaunting its splendor in the heart of the city. Crystal chandeliers cast their glow, reflecting off massive glass panels and gold-trimmed windows, creating a scene so extravagant it seemed more like a portrait of power than a real home. Guests arrived in glittering gowns and perfectly tailored suits, each step on the marble floor sounding like a silent symphony of status. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. To be here, you needed money, reputation, and the Hale family's seal of approval. Clarissa Hale stood at the center of the grand hall, composed and commanding. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her cold gaze sweeping across the crowd as she offered a calculated smile. Tonight was not just about hosting a party. It was about proving her place among the elite who scrutinized every move. Amid the music and shimmering wine in crystal glasses, Clarissa gently placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Noah, a 9-year-old boy, looked around with clear, confused eyes. His tiny hand clutched his mother's dress, his face blank under dozens of pitying stares. A whisper spread like wind. "Poor thing, autistic, and dragged into a party like this. She's just trying to get sympathy. That kid looks so empty." Clarissa heard every word, each one like a needle under her skin. Yet she smiled with pride, raising her voice above the murmurs. "This is Noah, my only son. He may not be like other children, but he is the greatest pride of my life." Her tone was firm, though beneath the confidence, a quiet doubt lingered. She loved her son, but had never truly known if Noah was capable of anything beyond the endless silence. From a corner of the room, a quiet figure watched. Marissa Carter, the thin black maid with long curly hair tied back, stayed low behind the service table. Her eyes were gentle, yet alert, because she knew exactly what happened when the powerful looked upon the vulnerable. Suddenly, Noah turned, his wide dark eyes searching for Marissa, and in that moment, it was as if he had found the only solid ground in the room. Then, breaking the fragile calm, a dry chuckle rang out. Sloan, the tall police officer with a cold face, his uniform and holstered gun radiating authority, stepped forward. He looked down at Noah, his gaze full of disdain, and let the words fall like a blade. What could this kid possibly know besides silence? The room tensed. Curious and amused stares shifted toward Clarissa. Sloan knew exactly what he was doing. His words didn't just target Noah, they struck at the Hale family's pride. Clarissa froze for a moment, but forced a smile, about to say something to ease the awkwardness. When Noah's tiny hand trembled and pulled back instinctively, her heart clenched, but before she could react, Marissa stepped forward. Her small frame barely stood out in the glamorous crowd, yet her eyes held a quiet resolve that made a few people pause. She knelt, gently gripping Noah's hand, a hand rough and thin from years of labor, now steadying his in a way that felt unshakably strong. Marissa leaned close to his ear and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, yet somehow echoing within her own heart, "You have your own voice." Those 4 words sparked something faint in Noah's deep, dark eyes, a flicker no mockery could extinguish. Clarissa looked up and met Marissa's gaze. For a moment, she saw something different in the woman, not the obedience of a servant, but an unwavering conviction. The air in the room grew tense. Guests whispered louder, a few smirked, and others watched Clarissa to see how she would respond. Sloan remained still, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, as if he had just scored a small victory. But in that very instant, the brief silence became the spark for a confrontation no one expected. No one in that room could have guessed that Marissa's quiet words, seemingly small and meaningless, would ignite a chain of events that would shake their entire world. Clarissa took a deep breath, her hand on Noah's shoulder tightening. Sloan watched her, throwing another challenging glance, while Noah let out a soft gasp, his eyes still locked on Marissa, waiting for a sign. And in that suspended moment, as the background music seemed frozen under the weight of invisible tension, Clarissa realized she had awakened an undercurrent that even she could not predict. The party went on, but no one truly cared about the wine or the soft music anymore. Everyone, from the powerful to the serving staff, had their eyes fixed on the 3 figures at the center of the storm. Clarissa Hale, the autistic boy Noah, and Marissa Carter, a wealthy mother, a silent child, and a black maid. 3 lives that should never have intersected, had now become the focus of a collision about to erupt. And in that moment, none of them knew that what was coming would go far beyond whispered insults, because the truth was only just beginning to unfold from a single whispered sentence: "You have your own voice." In the tense air of the grand hall, Crystal glasses still clinked under the lights, their sharp notes echoing faintly, but no one paid attention to the wine or the music anymore. All eyes were fixed on Clarissa and Noah, with Marissa's silhouette just behind them, watched closely by the curious elite. Sloan had just spat his contempt when Briggs, the officer with a hardened face and cold eyes, stepped forward. His voice sliced the air like a blade, laced with challenge. He jerked his chin toward Clarissa, lips curling into a cruel smile, and said slowly, "If you're that confident, make him say something right now." The entire room froze. The broken whispers vanished, swallowed by a heavy, growing silence. Clarissa stiffened, her expression shifting. For a moment, it felt like every stare was a blade pressed against her chest, tearing through the layer of confidence she had just built. She was used to whispers behind her back, but a direct challenge like this, in front of everyone, was something she had never imagined facing. Her hand instinctively tightened on Noah's shoulder, as if shielding him from the storm about to break. But her fingers trembled too, because deep inside, fear crept in. What if her son truly could not respond? What if Noah's silence became the proof of that insult? Then there would be no way back. Her lips parted, about to deflect the moment, but no words came. Her voice faltered. All she could do was lower her gaze, avoiding the hundreds of eyes drilling into her. Her heart pounded, each beat heavy like a hammer. In that instant, Clarissa Hale, the millionaire woman known for her pride and icy composure, bowed her head before the crowd. The sight made several people smirk, as if watching power itself choke on its own territory. As Clarissa remained silent, it seemed the matter was settled. But from behind her came a voice, not loud, yet firm enough to cut through the suffocating air. Marissa raised her head, eyes calm and unwavering, and spoke slowly. "Noah can speak. Not just one, but several languages." A spark of murmurs burst instantly, spreading like fire across dry grass. People glanced at one another, then at Marissa, as if she had just uttered something insane. Sloan raised an eyebrow. Briggs scoffed, and from across the room, Dalton, the heavy-set officer with a mean grin, stepped forward, sneering. His laugh slapped through the hall, making the glasses in guests' hands tremble faintly. He looked Marissa up and down with open disdain, then spat out each word. "A black maid teaching a millionaire kid? I want to see that joke." That sentence hit like a splash of cold water. Laughter erupted. Some covered their mouths to giggle, and others nodded in agreement. A few whispered that Clarissa had gone too far by letting a maid meddle in family matters, while others shook their heads, pitying her for becoming a joke among the wealthy. Yet Marissa's face didn't change. Her deep, dark eyes didn't flinch, on the contrary, they lit up with a quiet determination. Her hand stayed tightly clasped around Noah's, anchoring him with a strange, unwavering strength. Noah lifted his head and looked around. His eyes briefly clouded, as if he could feel the hatred and disdain from the faces surrounding him. He took a shaky breath, his small fingers gripping Marissa's. Clarissa saw everything, and for the first time, she felt the silent force radiating from the woman she had always treated as a shadow in her mansion. No one expected someone like Marissa to stand tall among the powerful, to confront police officers, used to giving orders and crushing resistance. Her words, simple in appearance but heavy with weight, flipped the balance in an instant. Now, what came next would no longer be just a moment of mockery. It would mark the beginning of a real confrontation, where honor, truth, and pride were laid bare under hundreds of watching eyes. Clarissa felt the blood rise in her body, her heart pounding, her vision flickering between humiliation and a flicker of fragile hope. She had never imagined allowing a maid to interfere in family matters, but Noah's gaze toward Marissa was unmistakable, as if he had found a lighthouse in the middle of a dark sea. Clarissa stood frozen, torn between pulling her son back and not wanting to extinguish the spark just born in his innocent eyes. The air in the grand hall was so heavy it could be sliced. Every breath, every soft cough seemed to startle. And then, they all waited. A silence stretched on, seemingly endless, pressing down on both Clarissa and Marissa. Every pair of eyes locked on them, no one daring to blink, because they knew this moment would decide who would hold their head high, and who would be crushed beneath the ridicule of the elite. Briggs glanced at Sloan and Dalton, the corner of his mouth curling as a glint of triumph flashed in his eyes. He thought the challenge he had thrown would make Clarissa collapse, turn Noah into a laughingstock before the entire hall, and stain the Hale family name with a shame that couldn't be erased. But he hadn't expected a small voice from the shadows to rise up, and that very act had opened the door to a confrontation he could no longer predict. Clarissa looked at Marissa, their eyes meeting in a moment of silence. On one side was fractured pride, on the other, unwavering belief. And between them stood Noah, the bewildered boy, whose eyes now gleamed with a faint light of hope about to become the center of a storm no one could stop. In that extravagant party, under the crystal lights and cruel laughter, what seemed like a trivial challenge had triggered a series of events that would bring everything crashing down. The instant Dalton let out that sneer, the sky of power above them began to shake. Every detail in the room, every look, every whisper shifted, as if the entire atmosphere sensed that something irreversible had begun. It was no longer a matter of pride or insult, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And from that moment on, no one in that lavish room could imagine how quickly the night would spiral into chaos, nor how deeply a single voice could change everything. Just as Dalton's sneer faded, Sloan slammed his hand down on the long table draped in white cloth, the sound echoing through the hall as crystal glasses shook and drops of red wine splattered like bloodstains across the fabric. The air thickened instantly, and heads turned sharply in his direction. Sloan leaned in, his eyes burning with challenge, voice booming over the soft background music. "Prove it, right here, in front of everyone. If the boy really knows how, let him speak now." His words fell like a hammer, forcing both Clarissa and Marissa into a corner with no escape. Clarissa felt her body turn cold, her knees weak. She had weathered high-stakes deals and faced off against rivals just as wealthy, but never had she felt such crushing pressure. Eyes bore into her, some guests smirking, as they waited for the Hale name to be humiliated. Others watched eagerly, hoping Noah's answer would be nothing but hopeless silence, something they could gossip about later. Clarissa lowered her head, her hand on her son's shoulder trembling. She wanted to pull him away, to end this cruel spectacle, but Noah's innocent eyes looked up, locked on her and Marissa, and her steps faltered. Marissa took a slow step forward, undeterred by the contempt in Sloane's eyes, or the sneers around them. She turned to Noah, her gaze calm and deep like a quiet river, filled with unwavering trust. She leaned close to him, her voice soft but steady. "Noah, you can do this. Show them what you've held in your heart all this time." The words were not loud, but the conviction in each syllable sent a chill through more than a few in the crowd. Noah trembled, his small hands gripping the hem of his shirt, thin shoulders shaking under the chandelier's glow. In that moment, he could hear his heartbeat pounding, could hear the snide whispers slicing through the air like blades. But when he looked up and saw the fire in Marissa's eyes, and his mother's lips pressed tight to hold back tears, he suddenly drew a deep breath. His lips moved, and he spoke, voice quiet, but clear. "Gracias por estar aquí." The entire hall went still. Those words, crisp and grammatically perfect, rang out in the opulent space like a blade, cutting through every trace of laughter. Clarissa froze, her heart tightening, eyes brimming with tears. She had never heard her son form a full sentence before, only scattered sounds and mumbles. Yet now, in front of hundreds, Noah had just spoken a complete phrase in Spanish. The crowd froze for a few seconds before the whispers erupted. Some stared wide-eyed in disbelief, others covered their mouths in shock, and a few let out awkward laughs, unsure if they could trust what they'd heard. A man near the main table muttered, Did he really just speak?" A woman beside him shrugged, trying to sound calm. "Maybe he's parroting. Kids mimic tones all the time," but her voice trembled, stripped of all certainty. Clarissa felt her heart pounding as if it might explode. Through every whispered word, she heard the fracture of prejudice, the uneasy shifting of those who had once mocked. Sloan frowned, tapping his fingers on the table, like he was grasping for a way to reclaim his slipping authority. Briggs glanced sideways at Dalton and let out a cold snort, trying to mask his unease. Dalton raised an eyebrow, lips twisting into a stiff smile, and growled, "It's just parroting. A kid can echo any sound he hears. That doesn't mean he understands." There were a few weak chuckles from those clinging to their side, but the weight of Noah's words didn't dissolve so easily. Clarissa gripped her son's shoulder tighter, her eyes now glowing with a belief she had never fully allowed herself to feel. She looked at Marissa and saw clearly that the woman's quiet strength wasn't a delusion. Marissa believed in Noah, and that belief had never been misplaced. Noah hesitated, eyes darting between his mother and Marissa. His lips parted as if to speak again, but the tension from the crowd made him retreat. Marissa gently squeezed his hand, her eyes encouraging. "You've already begun. Let them see how far you can go." He drew another breath, his body still trembling, but a strange light now flickered in his gaze. A few giggles echoed from the back of the room, but they quickly died as Noah's lips moved once more. No one in that opulent space expected what might come next. And yet, before he could speak, the air remained thick, stretching each second into an eternity. The hall stood on the edge between belief and doubt, mockery and awe. That small sentence hadn't convinced everyone, but it had planted something, a flicker of uncertainty that could not be ignored. Sloan clenched his jaw. Briggs bit his lip. Dalton scanned the room, trying to rally support with his eyes, but the power no longer fully belonged to them. Beneath the shimmering chandelier light, an autistic boy had spoken his first words in a language no one anticipated. And in that exact moment, the world of power inside the Hale mansion began to tremble at its very core. The air in the grand hall still trembled with the echo of Noah's first words, the Spanish syllables lingering like whispers in the light of the chandeliers and the stunned breaths of the crowd. But just as wonder began to bloom, Briggs stepped forward with long, heavy strides, his broad shoulders and imposing stance casting a shadow over both Noah and Marissa. Arms crossed, his face unreadable except for a sneering smile, he spoke with a sharp tone, meant to crush the fragile hope that had just begun to take root. He's just parroting. He doesn't understand a thing. The words, cruel and clean, sliced through the room like blades. Some guests nodded subtly, seizing the excuse not to accept what had just unfolded before their eyes. Noise surged again, laughter mixed with doubtful murmurs. A man nearby muttered with a smirk, "Yeah, kids mimic well. A few words don't mean much." A woman clicked her tongue. The maid probably stuffed a few lines into him, just putting on a show. Clarissa heard every word, each one stabbing her in the chest. She felt cornered, torn between shielding her son and collapsing under the pressure of hundreds of eyes and the suffocating weight of muffled ridicule. Meanwhile, Noah remained where he stood, tiny hands clenched, dark eyes darting around, confused but holding a strange glimmer deep within. He trembled, breath uneven, but as he felt Marissa's steady hand wrapped around his, he drew a long breath, lips parting. This time, it wasn't Spanish. It was the soft, rising rhythm of French. "Merci d'être venu ce soir." His voice rang out, every tone precise enough to startle those who had studied the language. The room fell into another stunned silence, whispers abruptly cut off. And before the shock could settle, Noah continued, his voice shifting into another language, firmer, crisper, unmistakably German. "Ich freue mich, euch hier zu sehen." The sentence left his lips without hesitation, without error, delivered with the clarity of a student trained for years. Gasps echoed from the back rows. Some covered their mouths, eyes wide, unable to believe what they were hearing. Guests who once prided themselves on refinement now looked dazed, as if a curtain had been yanked away. Briggs flinched, just slightly, then clenched his jaw and feigned indifference, forcing his face back into a mask of control. Dalton, who had been standing with arms crossed, suddenly furrowed his brow. He stepped forward, the stiff smile still stuck on his face, his voice lowering with barely hidden frustration. "That's enough. This little trick isn't fooling anyone." His words came out as if he alone had the right to decide what was real and what was not. He glanced around, seeking support from the crowd, but this time the laughter was sparse, the agreement weaker. In many eyes, doubt had begun to crack. Clarissa stood still, her eyes wide, glistening with tears. She looked at her son, the child she had long believed to be mute, disconnected, lost in silence. She had taken Noah to countless doctors and specialists, all of whom gave her only cold conclusions and hopeless diagnoses, insisting he would never communicate like other children. And yet now, right in front of her, her son had not only spoken, he had done something no one had imagined. He had spoken in the languages of many peoples. Her chest tightened, tears threatening to fall. She didn't know whether to cry from joy or guilt, for not having seen her child clearly all these years. To her, Noah was no longer the fragile boy in need of protection, but a hidden seed with strength. She had failed to recognize strength that only needed someone patient enough to give it space to grow. And that someone, she now saw clearly, was not her, but Marissa, the black woman so often dismissed, who had sparked the voice within her son. The room slipped back into tension. The cruel denials continued, but their force was fading. Truth could not be buried forever, especially not when it had spoken aloud in the very heart of power and pretense. Briggs, Dalton, and Sloan still clung to control, but their eyes betrayed the panic they tried to mask, because deep down, they knew what had just happened could not be erased with bitter words. In the shimmering light of the party, surrounded by murmurs and astonished stares, Clarissa saw her son clearly for the first time, not as a hollow shadow, but as a whole human being with abilities far beyond the limits others had forced upon him. In that moment, her heart broke wide open, letting the hot tears fall freely, washing away years of doubt and shame. Noah looked up, his face still innocent, but his eyes burned bright, like a quiet flame newly awakened, demanding the world around him to stop and listen. After Noah spoke fluent French and German, the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted noticeably. Shock and amazement rippled across the white-draped tables, and hands that once held wine glasses with proud elegance now hovered uncertainly in midair, unsure whether to raise them or set them down. Judging eyes turned doubtful. Proud lips faltered in search of justifications for earlier arrogance. But before any of it could settle, a burst of crude laughter tore through the room. Sloan, the officer with a face like rough stone, slapped his thigh with delight, his laughter echoing across the space as he drew every gaze toward him. Chin raised, he shot a look of pure contempt at Marissa and Clarissa, then barked out words that were both vulgar and venomous. What a damn circus. Letting a black maid run $1 million party. The line hit like a hammer, laced with a hoarse laugh that made even those nearby flinch from its sheer brutality. The words instantly ignited fresh whispers. A few guests sneered in support, casting resentful looks at Marissa, as if her presence alone had sullied the grandeur of the room. Some shook their heads, mumbling about how letting a servant stand before honored guests was a disgrace to the family name, while others narrowed their eyes in amusement, clearly hoping to watch Clarissa be crushed under the weight of elite expectations. Sloan's laughter dragged on, as if to drown the hall in its mockery, and in that chaos, Clarissa felt her chest tighten. She didn't know how to hold her ground beneath the glare of 100 eyes. Marissa remained where she stood, neither bowing her head nor stepping back. She tilted it slightly, her face lit by a calm that seemed almost unreal, her dark eyes fixed firmly on Sloan. Her voice rang out slowly but clearly. After Noah spoke fluent French and German, the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted noticeably. Shock and amazement rippled across the white-draped tables, and hands that once held wine glasses with proud elegance now hovered uncertainly in midair, unsure whether to raise them or set them down. Judging eyes turned doubtful. Proud lips faltered in search of justifications for earlier arrogance. But before any of it could settle, a burst of crude laughter tore through the room. Sloan, the officer with a face like rough stone, slapped his thigh with delight, his laughter echoing across the space as he drew every gaze toward him. Chin raised, he shot a look of pure contempt at Marissa and Clarissa, then barked out words that were both vulgar and venomous. What a damn circus. Letting a black maid run $1 million party. The line hit like a hammer, laced with a hoarse laugh that made even those nearby flinch from its sheer brutality. The words instantly ignited fresh whispers. A few guests sneered in support, casting resentful looks at Marissa, as if her presence alone had sullied the grandeur of the room. Some shook their heads, mumbling about how letting a servant stand before honored guests was a disgrace to the family name, while others narrowed their eyes in amusement, clearly hoping to watch Clarissa be crushed under the weight of elite expectations. Sloan's laughter dragged on, as if to drown the hall in its mockery, and in that chaos, Clarissa felt her chest tighten. She didn't know how to hold her ground beneath the glare of 100 eyes. Marissa remained where she stood, neither bowing her head nor stepping back. She tilted it slightly, her face lit by a calm that seemed almost unreal, her dark eyes fixed firmly on Sloan. Her voice rang out slowly but clearly, each word cutting through layers of arrogance like a blade. This skin taught him to hear the world. The sentence wasn't loud, wasn't angry, but the weight of it made the room hesitate. A ripple of unease spread instantly. Guests used to diplomatic dodging now found themselves confronted with the blunt truth. Some faces turned awkward, eyes drifting away, unwilling to meet what had just been said head-on. A few women covered their mouths, eyes darting nervously, as if afraid that silence would be mistaken for agreement. Yet there were others who exchanged glances, bitter smiles, still clinging to their lips, clearly unwilling to accept a rebuttal from someone they considered beneath them. Clarissa felt her heart unraveling. She was caught between two extremes. On one side, the undeniable truth her son had spoken, not in one but in multiple languages, something every doctor and specialist had once dismissed. On the other, the crushing social pressure and the public contempt now aimed directly at her, as if she had disgraced the entire Hale family by allowing a black maid to stand as her equal in $1 million gathering. Her eyes welled with tears, but her lips stayed tightly pressed, refusing to let a single word escape that might further strip her of dignity in front of the crowd. The murmurs in the hall hadn't even settled when Briggs stormed forward, his face flushed, eyes burning with humiliation. He jabbed a finger straight at Marissa's face, as if that single aggressive gesture could crush her in front of the entire room. His voice rang out, sharp and full of contempt. "You think you're a professor? What can a scrubbing maid teach?" The sound sliced through every whisper, leaving behind a heavy silence, as if the weight of the entire $1 million party had collapsed onto one woman alone. Guests nearby held their breath, some sneered, some frowned, but all eyes locked on Marissa, as if waiting for her to flinch, to crumble under the blow. But Marissa didn't flinch. She stood tall, still holding Noah's hand, her dark eyes lit with a calm so steady, even Clarissa couldn't hide her surprise. Her voice came out steady, unshaken, but carried the weight of a long-hidden truth. "I studied linguistics. I dropped out because I was poor, not stupid." The simple sentence hit the tile floor like a hammer, making several people hesitate. From the back rows came scattered whispers. Linguistics? She really studied? If that's true, then, the doubtful tone spread just enough to start cracking the blind belief in Briggs's mockery. Sloan raised an eyebrow. Dalton snorted. All three officers shifted uncomfortably, but none had time to interrupt, because just as Marissa's words landed, Noah suddenly looked up. His wide black eyes sparkled, his mouth parted, and he spoke in a new voice, soft, clear, and unmistakably fluent in a language no one expected. "Arigato, Marissa." The words, in perfect Japanese, rang out with such accuracy that anyone who had heard the language before would recognize it instantly. The room froze. All the laughter, all the cruel remarks vanished in an instant, swallowed by a silence so sharp it echoed. People sat like statues, mouths slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. One guest who had studied in Japan whispered hoarsely, He said it right. Thank you in Japanese. An older woman slowly nodded, eyes wide. That's not mimicking. The intonation, it's perfect. Clarissa felt herself pulled into that moment. Her heart tightened, each beat pounding inside her chest. She no longer saw her son as a silent shadow, but as a vibrant presence speaking words that shook the small world around her. Tears welled up. She raised a hand to cover her mouth, trying to stifle the sob rising in her throat, but her trembling shoulders betrayed the overwhelming emotion. She had never heard her son speak any full word in any language, only broken sounds yet now. Right before her eyes, Noah had confirmed a truth no one could deny. Briggs froze, a flicker of confusion flashing in his eyes before it was quickly replaced by anger. He stammered, It's just a coincidence. He probably heard it somewhere. But his voice had lost its edge, his words scattered and powerless. Sloan frowned, Dalton clenched his fist, and all three seemed pulled out of their usual place of control, forced to face a truth they could no longer crush with words. Marissa remained where she was, calmly watching Noah, the corners of her mouth lifting into a gentle smile. In her eyes, there was no gloating, only belief and pride. That calmness made the crowd even more unsettled. A few guests began to look away, avoiding the gaze of Clarissa and Noah, as if afraid of being drawn into the pull of the truth. Some lowered their faces to their wine glasses, trying to hide the shame of having joined in the mockery only moments earlier. Clarissa stood frozen, witnessing her son reach out to something miraculous, while realizing she had missed an entire world inside him. For years, she had chased prestige, consulted specialists, tried everything to force Noah to fit in, yet never once truly listened. And now, in that brief sentence in Japanese, she heard an entire ocean she had ignored, a treasure chest beside her all along, and she had never seen it. No laughter rose again. The officers stood like they had been doused in cold water. The elite guests sat motionless, and the entire hall hung in a heavy silence, tense, breathless, and stunned. For the first time in the evening, it wasn't wine or diamonds that held the room's attention, but the trembling, clear voice of an autistic child, and the truth laid bare by a woman long dismissed. Marissa gently placed her hand on Noah's shoulder, and gave a slight nod, her eyes glowing with a quiet light, as if saying, You just did what no one in this world dared believe. And in that moment, every prejudice, every insult, every cruel denial was silenced, making way for a raw and undeniable truth. This child had a voice, and this maid had handed him the key to unlock it. The air in the grand hall had just dipped into silence after Noah's unexpected Japanese when Dalton suddenly roared, his shout cracking through the room like a whip. Known for his brutality, his deep, grating voice now burned hotter under pressure. He pointed directly at Marissa, his face twisted in rage, every word soaked in contempt. You're using a sick child to glorify yourself. The words slammed into the air like iron spikes, filthy and heavy, causing several in the crowd to gasp, some to frown, but most remained silent, unready to face the raw ugliness of such open degradation. Noah flinched, his small hand pulling back, his eyes losing focus for a moment. He trembled, his chest rising and falling quickly in fear. The words inside him suddenly stuck. Clarissa saw it all, her heart aching, yet she stood speechless, frozen. She was used to handling rumors, used to fending off corporate rivals, but never had she felt so powerless as when her child was insulted in public. Marissa, in stark contrast to the chaos, stood firm. Her gaze never wavered. She turned to Dalton, lips drawn into a sharp line, then answered, her voice slow but unshakable, cutting through his falsehood like a blade. I gave him a chance. Something you never did. There was no shouting, no harsh tone. Yet each word landed like a punch to Dalton's chest, leaving his face drained, then flushed with fury. The crowd erupted. A wave of noise surged from the back of the hall, whispers mixed with gasps. Some let out awkward chuckles, others clapped half-heartedly, as if to test the charged air. Still, no one dared openly take sides, not while the weight of the three officers still loomed. Clarissa scanned the room, seeing clearly the fear, the cowardice, and the curious eyes waiting for her family to fall further into disgrace. Unable to bear it any longer, Clarissa suddenly stood, her chair screeching against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the tension like a bell. She looked directly at Dalton, hand clenched, her voice trembling yet carrying across the hall. Enough, don't touch my son. The words were simple, but they struck the room like a lightning bolt. It was the first time Clarissa had publicly pushed back against the humiliation she had long endured in silence. Noise erupted like crashing waves, spilling through the room. Some scoffed, others shook their heads, but more than a few eyes looked at Clarissa with sudden respect. Voices overlapped. She's lost it. This is the start of a scandal. But the boy did speak, each opinion feeding a whirlwind that tore through the party's shallow elegance. Dalton growled, his face flushed red, his fist clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sloan and Briggs, standing beside him, shifted uneasily, aware that control was slipping from their grasp. In the past, a single word from them could bury anyone. But now, with only a few sentences from Marissa and Clarissa's unexpected courage, the balance had shifted. The crowd was no longer fully on their side, and the murmurs in the room were cracks forming in the wall of power they had built. Noah stood silently, eyes brimming with tears, but within them glimmered a faint light at the sound of his mother's voice. He lifted his head slightly, lips moving, as if to speak another language, only to be swallowed again by the surrounding chaos. Marissa leaned down, her warm hand gripping his tightly, her gaze steady and encouraging, silently telling him he was not alone. The entire hall focused on the center of the confrontation. 3 arrogant officers, Clarissa trembling yet brave, and Marissa steady as a tower in a storm. This was no longer mockery. It had become a direct standoff, where words cut like blades and could shape the fate of everyone involved. Beneath the chandelier's glow, the polished faces of the elite began to warp, as they realized a truth none could deny. For the first time, those who had always dominated were being forced to defend themselves. Clarissa took a deep breath, her heart pounding, but this time she didn't step back. She placed her hand on her son's shoulder, a silent vow that from this moment forward, no one would lay a hand on Noah without consequence. Marissa saw it, nodded softly, and felt a rising respect for the wealthy woman now willing to face an uncomfortable truth. The noise still surged like crashing waves, but at the center stood those 3 formed into a small circle, where light poured down brightest, where every gaze converged, and where truth finally had a chance to rise, no matter how loud the insults. The uproar had barely begun to settle after Clarissa's trembling warning, when Sloan, who had smirked from the start and treated everything as a joke, suddenly lunged forward, his voice now more vicious and crude than ever. He braced himself against the table, leaning slightly toward the center, eyes bloodshot under the flickering chandelier light. Then he spat out each word like venom, shaking the room. What does a filthy black maid know besides scrubbing floors? The words pierced the air like knives, launched with all the contempt he carried for Marissa, for Noah, and for everything that had just unfolded. For a moment, the packed room fell into a chilling silence. The elite guests froze. A few inhaled sharply, others let out a dry scoff, but even those sounded brittle and hollow. Clarissa stood frozen, her eyes wide, the hand on Noah's shoulder trembling violently. She was used to whispers, to gossip drifting through the air, but rarely had she faced such blunt, brutal hatred spoken aloud in the opulent hall she had built and claimed as her own. It felt like being shoved into a dark corner, her dignity, and even her motherhood crushed under the gaze of 100 witnesses. Marissa held her ground, her eyes unwavering, but Clarissa knew she herself had reached her limit. A burning surge rose in her chest, blood rushed to her face, and in an instant, she lost all restraint. She stepped forward, her arm swung high beneath the glare of a dozen flashing cameras, and then a sharp crack rang out. Her hand struck Sloan's cheek with such force that the sound echoed through the hall. That fateful slap stunned the entire room. Sloan staggered back a step, his face flushed red, one hand flying to the welt blooming across his cheek. Gasps erupted. Someone dropped a wine glass, crystal shattering across the floor, tangled with murmurs of disbelief. Flash after flash lit up the scene. Hidden reporters at the party had caught it all. The rare moment when a powerful millionaire struck a police officer across the face, right in the heart of wealth and status. Sloan roared, his face twisted in rage, but before he could react, another voice tore through the chaos. Noah, his face flushed, his eyes blazing, shot up from his seat, one trembling hand raised. His voice rang out not in English, not in any language the crowd expected, but in Italian, sharp and full of fury. Basta, enough. The sound rang out sharp, clean, final, freezing the entire room. For the first time, Noah's voice wasn't trembling or hesitant, but carried weight like a blade slicing through the suffocating air. The packed crowd sat motionless, eyes wide, mouths open, unable to believe that a silent autistic boy had just shouted in a foreign language, with such precision and raw emotion. Clarissa turned to her son, tears gathering in her eyes, her lips trembling as if to say his name. She had never heard Noah speak with such force, had never seen him channel so much pain and courage into a single phrase. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just her resisting, not just Marissa defending Noah was standing up for himself. Sloan remained frozen, one hand on his cheek, eyes locked on Clarissa, but Noah's shout had pushed him half a step back. Briggs and Dalton, so used to silent submission, were now shaken by the words, "Enough," spoken by a child they had dismissed. The crowd stirred again, no longer just mocking laughter, but a mix of shock, confusion, and quiet admiration. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did he just speak Italian? Yes, I heard it clearly. That wasn't mimicry, he shouted, for real this time. Maybe we were wrong. The murmurs collided and multiplied, rising into a storm that swept across the hall. Clarissa felt her knees weaken, but she stayed upright, her chest rising and falling. Shame had vanished, replaced by a wave of pride tangled with regret. She turned to Marissa, and their eyes met in silent recognition. In that gaze, Clarissa saw the quiet strength that had saved her son, and Marissa saw that the wealthy woman had finally shed her pride to protect what mattered most. The hall held still for a few more seconds, then erupted in a storm of chatter, shouting, and flashing cameras. The scene exploded into something unlike anything seen at a high society party. Glasses hit the tables, chairs were pushed aside, clusters formed, and voices rose like a market at full roar. No one remembered the wine or the fine food. Everything now revolved around a single slap and a boy's Italian cry that shattered the silence. Clarissa held Noah's shoulder tightly, feeling each tremble of his body, not from fear, but from strength. Marissa stood beside them, her hand resting gently on the boy's back as if to say, "From now on, you will never be alone." And through the roaring storm, a new chapter of truth had begun, one that shook power, shattered prejudice, and cracked pride to its core. After the resounding slap and Noah's shout in Italian that shook the entire hall, no one dared to laugh anymore, and no voice of mockery rose again. All eyes turned to the three figures at the center, where truth was beginning to emerge and prejudice was falling apart. In the middle of the chaos, Marissa stepped forward slowly, her voice ringing clear, each word steady, as if to put a final end to all the denial. She explained that Noah didn't learn like other children. He didn't memorize through repetition or drills. He had a strange, innate ability. When he heard something once, the sounds, the words, the rhythm were imprinted instantly, and he could repeat them back perfectly. The room that once echoed with laughter now sank into heavy silence, because everyone understood that if what she said was true, then what they had witnessed could no longer be dismissed as a coincidence. Clarissa stood still, fists clenched, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at her son, eyes searching every small movement, trying to grasp an explanation for the wonder even she hadn't imagined. For years, she had been buried in appointments, reports, and cold diagnoses telling her that Noah would always live in his own world, incapable of real communication. But in the moment Marissa spoke the truth, Clarissa saw all those pages, all those conclusions, turned to dust. A new door had opened in front of her, and beyond it stood her son, carrying a potential no one had ever seen. The air in the room felt frozen. Some guests exchanged looks, their disdain slowly giving way to caution. A few eyes revealed regret for the things they had said, but no one spoke, because admitting the truth meant accepting they had been wrong from the start. Sloan and Briggs stood at a distance, faces rigid, facial muscles twitching with frustration. Dalton clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with anger but also touched by unease. The ones who had ruled with their words now faced a truth they couldn't silence. The boy they had dismissed held a gift beyond their comprehension. Clarissa stepped closer to her son, eyes brimming with tears. She softly called his name, her voice trembling, as if afraid that speaking it aloud would shatter the fragile moment. Noah looked up at her, his gaze innocent yet glowing, as if asking whether she finally saw him now. Clarissa's heart ached, realizing she had lived too long in blindness toward the child she had given life to. She didn't know what Noah was capable of. She didn't understand him, and that truth filled her with shame. But alongside it came a deep, overwhelming pride, because in her son's eyes, she saw an entire world waiting to be discovered. Marissa looked at Clarissa, her eyes filled with quiet conviction. She didn't need many words, but her presence alone made it clear that everything Noah had achieved today was because someone believed in him and chose to listen. In a room full of power and pride, the black woman they had dismissed was the very bridge that helped a little boy step out from the shadows of silence. And because of that, the mocking laughter from earlier turned into heavy, downcast gazes. No one dared to add another sneer. In that silence, Clarissa turned to face the crowd, her eyes scanning each face. She saw fake smiles fading, lifted chins now lowered. Some guests avoided her gaze, others looked down, unwilling to face the truth. Clarissa understood that this moment was not only changing her and Noah, but was forcing every witness in the room to confront themselves. The truth now laid bare could no longer be hidden behind any mask. Noah remained silent, but the air around him had shifted. Among hundreds still stunned, the small boy had become the center of the room, not through pity, but through rising awe. Clarissa wiped away a tear, her hand resting on her son's shoulder, trembling but filled with resolve. She knew from this moment on, their lives would never be the same, because a strange secret had just been revealed, and it had the power to change everything. Briggs clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening as he saw the atmosphere turning in Marissa and the boy's favor. He spat his words like blades, trying to sever the wave of admiration growing in the room. "He's a freak, not a genius." The cruel words echoed through the hall, jolting many to attention. It wasn't just an insult to Noah, it was a last-ditch attempt to pull the crowd back into the familiar grip of control, where those in power were free to define others by their scorn. The statement landed like a hammer, and the room immediately trembled with split reactions. On one side, A few of the front row elite nodded subtly, their eyes reflecting agreement, as if they had found a reason to dismiss everything they had just witnessed. They muttered that the boy was abnormal, that speaking many languages was just another form of disorder, not a gift to be proud of. They smirked, as if that insult was a lifeline for their cracking pride. But on the other side, another group of guests stood stunned, unable to ignore what had unfolded. They looked at Noah, remembered every word he had spoken in different tongues, then turned to Marissa and to Clarissa's tearful eyes, living proof that could not be denied. In their eyes, doubt was turning into turmoil, and more than a few began leaning toward the belief that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The entire hall had become a silent battlefield, whispers tangled with sharp breaths, chairs scraped against the floor, and hands awkwardly set wine glasses down. Some covered their mouths, whispering that this child was the sign of a rare genius, while others growled that it was nothing more than nature's deformity. The divide was glaring, stretching the atmosphere taut like a string about to snap. Clarissa stood in the center, absorbing every conflicting stare, her heart feeling torn to pieces. She had just heard her son called a monster, yet she saw him shine in a way she had never imagined. Tears welled up, but her hand remained firm on Noah's shoulder, as if to shield him from the invisible arrows flying their way. Meanwhile, Noah couldn't fully understand the cruel words, but he could feel the tension choking the room. His eyes blinked not in fear, but with a strange defiance, as though he wanted to prove his worth through action, not argument. Marissa remained composed, but her gaze swept the room like a blade. She knew people like Briggs wouldn't stop, because they feared truths they couldn't control. But she also saw faces in the crowd beginning to shift, timid eyes flickering with the glow of hope. That, she knew, was the sign. The wall of prejudice was cracking, and with one more push, it would crumble. The air grew thick, so tense that even breathing felt heavy. Every glance, every whispered word became a weapon, turning the hall into an arena where truth and bias fought fiercely. In the midst of it all, Noah stood under the chandelier's glow, small yet unwavering, the undeniable focus of the room. He had just been called a monster, yet was also being seen as the one breaking past the human limits they had long accepted. That very divide pushed the room to its breaking point, where a single nod or shake of the head could ignite a storm ready to erupt. The suffocating tension that followed Briggs's cruel remark was suddenly torn apart by Noah's voice. The boy stood tall, eyes shimmering, his face still innocent, but his gaze shining bright, lips moving non-stop. Each word spilled out in a continuous stream, as if an invisible door had flung open inside his mind. First came the echo of Spanish, followed by the sweetness of French, then the sharp edge of German, the calmness of Japanese, the rhythmic tones of Italian, the ringing depth of Arabic, the thickness of Russian, the clarity of Portuguese, and even the clipped precision of Mandarin. It all flowed like a living symphony, smooth and harmonious, each language an instrument, each sentence a melody, creating a soundscape no one could deny. The crowd froze for several seconds, then the silence exploded into chaos. Some jumped up, hands clutching their heads in disbelief. Others stepped back, chairs scraping loudly on the marble floor, eyes wide like they had witnessed a supernatural event. A group of guests began clapping, hesitantly at first, then more forcefully, as if trying to shatter the fear hanging in the air. The applause blended with gasps of astonishment, forming a strange symphony of its own, half awe, half confusion, making the atmosphere all the more electric. Clarissa stood still, eyes blurred with tears. She didn't catch every word Noah said, didn't understand all the languages, but she felt the rhythm spreading through the room. Each word was a blade slicing through the wall that had separated them for years. Each phrase, a living proof of the life blooming within the child she once believed would be forever trapped in silence. She clutched her chest, her heart ready to burst, part with pride, part with sorrow, at realizing she had never truly seen the strength of her own son. Marissa stood beside him, her face glowing under the chandelier's light, eyes fixed on every word that left Noah's mouth. Her lips curved into a gentle smile filled with fierce pride, because this was the moment she had quietly prepared, nurtured, and waited for. She said nothing because words were no longer needed. Noah's voice had spoken for her, had confirmed everything, had forced the most powerful people in the room to fall silent and listen. Sloan, Briggs, and Dalton were stunned, their faces drained of color. The ones who had mocked could no longer laugh. They looked at one another, searching for something to hold on to, but only found panic mirrored back in each other's eyes. Briggs clenched his jaw, sweat beading on his forehead. Dalton bit his lip until it bled, while Sloan stood frozen, the hand that once gripped power now trembling. The venom they had spewed, moments earlier, now weighed heavily on them, because the entire room had just witnessed the truth they tried so desperately to bury. The ballroom turned into a sea of emotion. Some guests broke into tears, others mumbled softly that they had been wrong, and a few tried to force a smile, but their eyes drifted away. Everyone was drawn to the center, where the boy stood, small yet shining brighter than any light in the room. The sound of countless languages blended together like an invisible choir, leaving behind an echo no one in that space would ever forget. Clarissa stepped forward, her trembling hands resting on her son's shoulders. Noah turned to her, eyes glowing, his mouth still releasing the final words in a foreign tongue. In that moment, she knew she was not just touching the shoulders of a child, but reaching into a treasure, a miraculous truth that had just been revealed. The applause continued, mixed with gasps and murmurs. No one could maintain the arrogant expressions they wore at the start, because all had to admit they had just witnessed something far beyond prejudice, a gift no power could deny. The lavish hall was no longer a showcase of wealth, but had become the stage for an unexpected symphony. And at the center of that symphony, Noah, the child once called a monster, stood tall as living proof of a hidden strength society had chosen to ignore. Clarissa moved closer, a storm rising inside her, the events from the start of the night to this very moment, blurring the line between dream and reality. Noah stood there, small but brilliant, his voice ringing out in many tongues, stunning the entire room, and at that very moment, she could no longer hold back. Clarissa opened her arms, wrapped them around her son, and pulled him tight against her chest, as if trying to shield him from every piercing gaze. She leaned down, her breath short and rapid, her voice hoarse, but filled with warmth. "You've never spoken to me before." That whisper was not only surprise, but a choked cry of a mother realizing how much she had missed, how long she had failed to see the miracle unfolding in her child. Noah looked up, his eyes glistening, not fully grasping his mother's words, but feeling the tremble in her embrace. He shifted slightly, as if wanting to say more, then buried his face into her shoulder, the place where, for the first time, he felt completely safe. Clarissa held him tighter, tears pouring down, letting them fall freely onto his face, merging with every breath. Like a silent apology, she had never had the chance to speak. The scene left many in the ballroom speechless, the noisy whispers from earlier slowly fading, giving way to an atmosphere thick with emotion. Some guests turned away, eyes glistening as if unwilling to let others see the tears they had just shed, while others kept their faces stiff, but their hands had relaxed, no longer gripping their wine glasses so tightly. Everyone seemed to be caught in the whirlwind of truth that had just erupted, a truth that could no longer be denied about the strength and value of this child. While Clarissa was still wrapped around her son, Marissa stood tall, her small frame firm, her eyes glowing like a spark newly lit in the dark. Without speaking, her gaze alone was enough to silence any further mockery. She looked directly at Sloan, Briggs, and Dalton, the three men who had so openly humiliated others, her eyes unwavering, blazing like a flame challenging the entire structure of power. In that look was not only protection for Noah, but an unshakable belief that she had been right, that this boy did not need pity, but deserved to be seen with full dignity. The crowd could feel the heat radiating from that small woman. A few cautious glances shifted toward Marissa, then quickly turned away, as no one wanted to confront the raw strength she embodied. Meanwhile, a few hesitant claps sounded from the back of the hall, sparse at first, then gradually spreading, blending into the tense air. The applause was neither loud nor unanimous, but it carried the weight of quiet acknowledgement, an admission that the truth had surfaced and could no longer be distorted. Clarissa looked up and met Marissa's eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the two women from seemingly opposite worlds understood each other better than anyone else. One was a wealthy mother who had just found her son's long-lost voice, the other, a black housemaid once dismissed, who had patiently nurtured that hidden miracle. Their eyes met, no promises exchanged, but a silent bond was forged, marking the beginning of a new journey. The ballroom held its breath, everyone aware that they had just witnessed a moment no power or wealth could suppress. A child with autism had just been embraced by his mother, a small yet resolute woman who stood tall under the lights, defying everything that had long oppressed them. And in the spark glowing in Marissa's eyes, people recognized an undeniable truth. This confrontation had only just begun, and true power did not belong to those who held authority, but to those who dared to believe in the survival of a voice once thought to be buried. Just one night later, what happened inside the Hale mansion had already broken past its towering iron gates and swept across the city like a storm. The next morning, newspapers ran sensational headlines in unison, from tabloids to major publications, all racing to expose the event no one wanted to miss. Autistic boy speaks 9 languages. The bold print on the front page stunned thousands, accompanied by a photo of Noah standing in the grand hall with glowing eyes, Clarissa embracing him, and Marissa standing firmly by their side. The snapshot of that moment became a symbol, both strange and powerful, impossible to look away from. On social media, phone-recorded videos taken by party guests spread like wildfire, amassing millions of views within hours. The comment sections exploded with amazement, fierce debate, and outrage over the insults hurled at the boy and the housemaid. But public opinion never stays still, especially when power is under threat. That very day, The 3 police officers present at the party simultaneously appeared on television, wearing stern expressions, speaking clearly as if they alone held the scales of justice. They made no mention of the fateful slap, nor did they acknowledge the truth witnessed by hundreds. Instead, they aimed straight at Marissa. On a live broadcast, Sloan casually claimed the maid had exploited a mentally challenged child to stage a scene, accusing her of feeding him scripted lines for attention. Briggs added fuel, calling it a cheap PR stunt by a servant desperate for fame. Dalton was even crueler, insisting Noah's ability to speak multiple languages was nothing more than a disorder, something pitiful rather than brilliant. Those accusations echoed through the evening news, replayed over and over, instantly polarizing public opinion. On one side, those who had seen the video insisted it couldn't possibly be mere mimicry, pointing out how Noah's speech was too fluid, his pronunciation too precise, acknowledged even by native speakers. They believed the powerful were scrambling to bury the truth to hide the shame they had suffered in front of the world. On the other side, skeptical voices rose, questioning why, if Marissa had no agenda, she would dare to speak out at such a lavish event, and why she would allow a child to become the center of such a storm. Clarissa sat in the vast living room, the television screen flashing images of the 3 officers, speaking one after another, the flickering light casting shadows across her face. She heard every fabricated word, her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her skin until they drew blood. Each false accusation felt like a blade twisting in her chest, not only because they were smearing Marissa, but because they were deliberately turning Noah into a tool of attack. Clarissa knew exactly what she had witnessed with her own eyes, knew her son had truly spoken in multiple languages, but now, she felt the full weight of power when it was determined to bend the truth. Marissa was different. She wasn't surprised to see herself become the center of slander. In her cramped apartment in the housing complex, she sat before an old screen, her expression calm, though her eyes held a quiet intensity. She was used to being looked down on, used to the contempt that followed her every time she stepped into a luxurious space. But this time was different, because they weren't just insulting her, they were targeting Noah, a child who deserved respect. Marissa knew that from this moment on, nothing would be simple. She had placed herself and the child into the eye of a storm, where truth and lies would clash violently, and justice would have to fight for every inch of ground between light and shadow. The aftershock of that night didn't just shake the Hale family or send waves through the city. It opened a new chapter full of danger. The slander had sown more doubt, but it had also ignited a wave of people searching for the truth. And at the center of that storm, Clarissa, Noah, and Marissa understood they could no longer back down, because once the truth has sparked, it can never be extinguished, no matter how fiercely power tries to smother it. News spread like wildfire, not just through the media, but into every corner of the financial world where Clarissa Hale was one of the most powerful figures. In the elegant boardroom of her corporation, the board of directors sat in a long row, their faces cold, their eyes sharp as arrows pointed straight at her. Gone were the usual praises and respectful nods. Now Clarissa faced pressure from the very people who once celebrated her name. One elderly chairman spoke, his voice crisp and blunt. "Mrs. Hale, this situation has become a laughingstock in every headline. We need a clear decision, or the company's reputation will plummet." The others nodded in agreement. No one mentioned the truth of that night. They only cared about profit, about stock prices, and the survival of the Hale name in the marketplace. Clarissa sat upright, both hands resting on the polished wooden table, but her heart felt heavy as stone. She wanted to speak up for her son, to affirm that what had happened wasn't a delusion. But every gaze around the boardroom was ice cold, refusing to let her place maternal instinct above collective interest. Another voice cut in, soft but sharp. "That maid caused the scandal. You can't keep her if you want our continued support." The words sliced through Clarissa like a blade, because she knew Marissa had done nothing wrong. She had been the one who gave Noah the strength to find his voice. But within this cold circle, Clarissa felt cornered, torn between personal honor and the burden of protecting an empire. In the end, Clarissa bowed her head silently, offering nothing but a slow nod. It wasn't true agreement, but a surrender under immense pressure, a painful choice made by a woman shackled to status and power. Shame swelled inside her, because she knew she was betraying the only woman who had stood by Noah when everyone else turned away. Clarissa's vision blurred with tears. She refused to let fall, but she knew the board had gotten what they came for, a decision to quiet the storm of public outrage. That afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight clung to the villa's rooftops, Marissa stood at the threshold, holding an old cloth bag, her eyes fixed on the familiar space where she had poured her heart into caring for Noah. The grand estate still glowed with warm lights, but to her, it had never felt colder. No farewell was spoken. No one dared meet her eyes, because everyone knew this departure was unjust. Clarissa stood at a distance, her figure frozen, too ashamed to step forward, knowing it was her signature that sealed this decision. Noah ran after her, his small hand grasping at the hem of her shirt, eyes brimming with tears, He didn't understand why the one who helped him speak had to leave, only that his world was falling apart. Marissa bent down, quickly wiping a tear from his cheek, her voice soft but firm. "You have to believe in yourself. Even if I'm not here, your voice is still yours." Then she turned away, her footsteps slow and steady on the stone floor, each echo carving the loss deeper into the silence. The gates of the estate closed behind her, separating her from the luxurious world she had never truly belonged to. Outside, the sky turned a deep purple, cold wind rustling through the trees, carrying with it a hollow stillness. Inside, Clarissa held her son close, her tears falling into Noah's soft hair. She whispered an apology he couldn't fully understand, but in her eyes was a silent promise. The truth would not stay buried forever. And so, from the aftershock of that night, a deeper fracture began to spread, not just in society beyond those gates, but within the hearts of everyone it had touched. Marissa walked away from the iron gates of the Hale estate on a cold, windy afternoon, her steps heavy but the fire in her eyes unextinguished. Returning to the rundown housing block, with peeling paint on patchy walls and dim corridors lit by flickering bulbs, Marissa felt everything achingly familiar. The sound of children playing in the yard, the faint scent of cheap food drifting from cramped apartments, all pulled her back to this simple reality, where no one asked about titles or pedigree, where life was hard but honest. She climbed the rough cement stairs, her hand gripping the worn fabric bag, as if holding on to the last piece of peace left after the storm. In the small room on the third floor, her older sister opened the door and saw Marissa's tired figure. No questions were needed, she understood what had happened. With a firm embrace, she offered silent comfort. "You did everything you could, Marissa," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "We don't need to prove anything to anyone. What matters is that you gave that child hope." Marissa rested her head on her sister's shoulder, eyes closed, feeling the warmth of family soothe the sting of what had been taken from her. In the modest apartment, the old fan creaked and yellow light flickered down, but peace slowly returned within her. A few days passed, and Marissa tried to fall back into her routine. She taught small classes at the nearby community center, helped her sister look after the neighborhood kids, but every night, Noah's image returned to her mind. She remembered the bright light in his eyes when he spoke, the small hand clutching at her shirt on the day they said goodbye. Marissa knew the boy wouldn't accept the separation easily, because he had found in her the kind of belief no one else had ever offered him. One afternoon, as the sun faded behind the old rooftops, there came a gentle knock on the door. Marissa opened it and froze. Noah stood there, arms wrapped around a stack of books and papers, his face flushed from climbing the stairs, eyes filled with both worry and determination. He didn't speak at first, just quietly handed her the language books he loved, pages covered in scribbled, childish notes. "I brought these to you," Noah said softly, voice shy but clear, "so we can keep learning." Marissa's heart swayed. She knelt to meet his eyes, her hand gently brushing the worn cover of a book. "Noah, you've done something very brave by coming here," she said, voice tight with emotion, gentle but firm. "But do you know this could be dangerous? If someone sees you came to me, they won't let it go." Noah shook his head, his eyes shining with rare resolve, then placed the book in her hand like a silent plea. Marissa held the stack of notebooks, feeling her hands tremble, because she understood these weren't just pages. They were a symbol of the trust the boy had placed entirely in her. Outside the hallway, children's laughter echoed, and wind slipped through the door, gently stirring the thin curtain. In that moment, Marissa knew that the divide the powerful had tried to enforce could never stop one simple thing: a child's desire to learn and be heard. And in this place of poverty, inside a tiny room, a green shoot quietly took root, promising to bloom one day stronger than ever. Clarissa left the corporate headquarters with a heavy mind, the endless meetings and the board's questioning stares still haunting her. She wanted to go somewhere to find peace, but her feet brought her instead to the old housing block on the city's outskirts, a place she had never imagined herself setting foot in. The narrow street glowed dimly with yellow lights, walls stained, windows rusted. Everything stood in stark contrast to the luxury she was used to. Clarissa walked slowly, her luxury car parked discreetly around the corner, and entered the aging building with an inexplicable pull guiding her. As she passed a dark hallway, she suddenly stopped, her eyes drawn to the last apartment, where a soft light spilled out through the crack beneath the door. She stood still, one hand gripping the cold metal frame, eyes fixed on the scene inside through a narrow window. Noah sat on the floor, surrounded by piles of books. Old notebooks opened before him, pages filled with scribbled words. Marissa sat beside him, patiently guiding each line, her eyes glowing with focus, her lips moving gently like a melody. Noah looked up, his eyes shining, repeating each syllable, not timid but eager. He pronounced every word clearly, and the faint light of the apartment seemed to blend with his voice, transforming the humble space into a living classroom. Clarissa couldn't move, her eyes misting over, her chest tightening like someone had gripped her heart. She had never seen her son so determined, never seen that glimmer of joy on his face while learning. In their grand estate, surrounded by countless specialists, Noah had never spoken so freely. Yet here, between peeling walls and cold tile floors, the boy was fully himself. Clarissa saw the contrast with painful clarity. What wealth and power had failed to bring to life was now blooming in a home the elite would scorn. She raised her hand to cover her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that escaped. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away, letting them fall as witness to a truth she could no longer deny. The belief she had clung to for years that every problem could be solved with the best resources, tight control, and powerful connections was beginning to crumble at its foundation. She realized it was that very coldness that had kept Noah locked in silence, while Marissa, with patience and trust, had opened the door for him to step out. In that moment, Clarissa's heart flooded with both shame and gratitude. She was ashamed for having once looked down on that woman, but grateful, too, because it was Marissa who had allowed her to see a different Noah, a boy full of potential and yearning. Clarissa stood still for a long time, her vision blurred, letting the soft laughter of her son drift out from the small apartment and wrap around her, pulling her out of the icy shell of pride she had worn. And in that fleeting moment, the unshakable belief she had carried for so long cracked, making room for a warmer truth. Her son didn't need grandeur, only someone who believed he could speak and deserved to be heard. After days of non-stop media coverage, filled with both praise and suspicion surrounding Noah, Sloan and Briggs launched their counterattack. They refused to let the story become a victory for an autistic child and a black housemaid. At a hastily arranged press conference held at the station, Sloan stood before a row of cameras, his face stern, voice sharp as if unveiling irrefutable evidence. He claimed Marissa had exploited Noah's condition to stage a publicity stunt, alleging that everything at the party had been orchestrated to draw attention and turn a helpless boy into a tool for personal ambition. Briggs stood beside him, nodding and adding fabricated details, stressing that they had proof Marissa had deliberately spent time with Noah beforehand to prepare him and stage the entire display for the guests. The news was immediately rebroadcast across television networks, with bold red headlines reading, "Housemaid accused of exploiting autistic boy for fame," shocking the public. Even the outlets that had once featured positive coverage of Noah quickly pivoted, publishing pieces with accusatory tones, because sensationalism sold better than truth. Evening talk shows brought in guests to debate the issue. Some claimed Marissa was an opportunist, while others cautiously questioned her true motives. Online, thousands of comments emerged, splitting into sharply divided camps. One side raged, convinced Marissa had used a child to chase fame, calling her a fraud. They reposted selectively edited clips, deliberately omitting the moments when Noah had spontaneously spoken multiple languages, twisting everything into something forced and artificial. But the other side continued to defend her, insisting that what they had seen with their own eyes couldn't be fake. They recalled the moment Noah shouted "Basta" with genuine fury, and the way his face lit up when learning with Marissa. Still, the power of one-sided media was overwhelming, fueling a tidal wave of public backlash. Clarissa sat in her spacious office, eyes fixed on the screen as Marissa's image was dragged through the mud. Every word of accusation felt like a knife driven into her chest. She knew exactly who had helped her son find his voice, but outside, the public was being manipulated into believing it had all been a lie. Clarissa felt trapped because Ishi spoke up. She would be pitted against the board of directors and crushed by the influence of those who controlled the industry. Meanwhile, Marissa had no platform left to defend herself. She remained silent, choosing not to engage in the loud arguments, because she understood one thing. Anything she said now would be twisted, turned into a weapon against her. Instead, she kept teaching at the community center, quietly devoting time to other children. But that silence was taken by some as proof of guilt, further strengthening the narrative pushed by Sloan and Briggs. The city felt as if it were on fire with the story. In cafes, bus stops, and offices, people talked about it everywhere. The name Marissa Carter was everywhere, but no longer as the brave woman who gave Noah his voice. Instead, she was portrayed as manipulative, greedy, and disgraceful. The public's outrage boiled over, as if they had forgotten that just days earlier, they had cried and been moved by Noah's words. The scheme set in motion by the police officers had begun to take effect, at least on the surface. But amid the deafening noise, there were hearts that refused to turn away. People who knew the truth couldn't be buried forever. And within the wave of attacks, a quiet flame of resistance was lit, signaling that fiercer battles were still to come. Caught in the storm of public backlash, Clarissa was pulled into the center of chaos she could no longer control. The board of directors, the media, and the most powerful shareholders all issued a united ultimatum: pressuring her to take decisive action to preserve the family's reputation. They had no patience for the surrounding controversy and no interest in hearing her version of what had truly happened at the party. A press conference was hastily arranged on the grounds of the Hale estate, the grand garden transformed into a crowded scene of lenses, microphones, and overlapping whispers. Clarissa stood at the podium, bright lights glaring at her face, her lips trembling, but her eyes showing the weight she had no choice but to bear. As reporters hurled questions one after another, she could only take a deep breath and speak. Her voice was hoarse. To preserve our family's reputation and avoid further controversy, I am forced to terminate Marissa Carter's employment with the Hale household. The sound of camera shutters rang out like rapid gunfire, whispers rising across the courtyard. Some faces looked smug, seeing this as a triumph of power, while others were stunned, unable to believe Clarissa had agreed to such a decision. In a corner of the room, Marissa stood still, her eyes calm yet deep, her small figure uncrushed by the harsh glare of public scrutiny. She didn't cry, didn't explain, only gave a slight nod as if she had long foreseen this outcome. In that moment, the entire space seemed split into two worlds, one filled with the noise of those who believed in surface appearances, and the other with the proud silence of a woman pushed out of the spotlight. Noah stood in the middle, not yet fully understanding what his mother's words meant, but instantly feeling the loss. His eyes widened, lips quivering, then a scream broke free, tearing through the space filled with cameras and chatter. He called Marissa's name, his voice breaking, then lunged toward her like someone who had just lost the most important thing in his world. The books he had brought were scattered across the floor, pages flapping in the wind. Noah cried out, his sobs turning into jumbled sounds, a storm of languages, French, German, Spanish, Japanese all colliding in a chaotic whirlwind. The crowd froze, many visibly shaken by the scene. A small boy, who had once amazed them with fluent sentences, was now caught in a panic, words pouring from his mouth like a desperate plea. Clarissa rushed to hold him, but Noah thrashed, arms flailing through empty air, eyes fixed only on Marissa. Amid the screams, Clarissa realized she had just lost the most precious thing of all, her son's trust. Marissa stepped forward, then stopped when the security barrier blocked her path. Her eyes burned bright with pain, but she said nothing, letting Noah's cries mix with the wind and the clicks of cameras. The sight stunned the entire room, leaving no one with enough reason to still call it staged. His cries and panic were too raw, too real, forcing even the hardest faces to look away. Clarissa clutched her son tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks, but she knew too well that any defense now would be too late. And so, the press conference ended with a deep cut in everyone's heart, the truth forced outside, while the vulnerable paid the highest price. Noah sobbed in his mother's arms, his small body trembling, but the voice coming from his mouth didn't sound like any panic attack anyone had ever witnessed. Under the flashing lights, amid the echoing noise throughout the courtyard, the boy spoke in 9 languages at once, each language overlapping, colliding, blending together like a strange choir echoing through space. Spanish, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Russian, Arabic, Mandarin, Portuguese, each burst forth, no longer fragmented, no longer isolated phrases, but a continuous stream, a cry for help that crossed borders, a relentless symphony that gave no one the chance to turn away. The crowd that had once buzzed with noise now stood frozen, some stunned, some clutching their chests as if breathless, while cameras frantically captured every second, terrified to miss a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Clarissa clutched her son, her vision blurred with tears, unable to understand every word but hearing everything more clearly than anyone else. This wasn't the voice of an unconscious child, nor an echo of memorized sound, but the fierce outpouring of a soul long suppressed, now breaking through every barrier. Marissa stood a few steps away, eyes ablaze, her lips moving along with every language. Noah spoke, her hands clenched as if sending him strength from afar. The guests who had once joined in mockery now fell silent, their expressions shifting to shock, because the truth was now undeniable, leaving no space for pretense. Within minutes, clips of Noah crying out in 9 languages began surfacing on social media. First came blurry short videos posted by party guests. Then they spread like wildfire. Headlines exploded. Autistic child speaks 9 languages in panic. Miracle or truth buried too long. A cry for help shakes the city. Millions of views poured in within hours, and thousands of comments from around the globe. People no longer argued whether it had been staged, because the chaotic yet precise sound was too clear, too real, impossible for anyone to dismiss. Television stations scrambled to replay the footage, anchors exclaiming that they had never seen anything like it. Several linguists were interviewed overnight, unable to hide their astonishment, affirming that the boy's pronunciation was unbelievably accurate. Those who had once doubted now began to waver, while those who had believed from the start swelled with pride, seeing Noah as a living testament to the wonders of the human mind. public opinion exploded into a furious wave, cracking the surface of lies that Sloan and Briggs had hastily constructed. The slander against Marissa faded in comparison, as millions witnessed an undeniable truth. Across forums and media platforms, people began calling Noah, the boy with 9 voices, an unexpected symbol of courage and the longing to be heard. Clarissa stared at her phone screen, watching the clip spread at lightning speed, tears welling in her eyes, because she knew from that moment on, no matter how powerful the force trying to bury it, Noah's voice had broken free of control. In the small apartment in the housing block, Marissa quietly replayed the video, her lips trembling, one hand over her chest, feeling the rapid pounding of her heart. She understood that the battle would only grow fiercer, that those in power would not easily let go, but she also knew the fight was no longer just hers or Noah's. The truth had been released, millions of eyes had seen it, millions of hearts had stirred, and once that voice had been heard, it would live on, in the memory of anyone who had listened, a testimony to something that could never be buried. Noah was no longer the hidden child behind a wall of silence. He had become the embodiment of a voice that could not be denied. After the clip of Noah crying out in 9 languages went viral, public interest quickly moved beyond curiosity or confusion and turned into heated demands for accountability. On social media, one question echoed like a refrain: who's really lying? Some aimed directly at officers Sloan and Briggs, accusing them of fabricating stories to take down a black woman who dared to speak against injustice. Others cast doubt on Clarissa, suggesting the wealthy heiress had exploited her son to redeem her declining corporate image. But most of the speculation swirled around Marissa, placing her at the center of 2 extremes, praised as a symbol of bravery by some, condemned as a fraud by others. On television, debate programs brought in experts to dissect every detail. Some argued it was impossible for an autistic child to speak with such fluency unless heavily coached, implying Marissa had orchestrated the entire thing. In contrast, certain linguists pointed to documented cases of one-time hearing, instant retention abilities, claiming Noah might be one of those rare individuals, making it impossible to deny his talent. These opposing viewpoints further polarized public opinion, and the name Marissa Carter began appearing across every major outlet, becoming an unavoidable focal point. At cafes, bus stops, and on the streets, the story was on everyone's lips. A group of young people insisted, "Marissa's the one telling the truth. The evidence is right there in the clip." Meanwhile, a few middle-aged passers-by shook their heads, saying, maybe she's just good at staging drama to get the world's attention. Every conversation, every whisper pushed the story further, feeding an ever-growing wave of public opinion. Online newspapers published conflicting headlines, some declaring, "The Black Housekeeper and the Gifted Child," others shouting, "The tearful act of an opportunist," making it harder for the public to distinguish truth from fabrication. Clarissa followed it all in silence, her mind a tangled mess. Every time someone asked, "Who's really lying?" it felt like a needle stabbing straight into her chest, a reminder that her own silence and rushed decision had helped thrust Marissa into the eye of a storm. She remembered the look in her son's eyes as he cried out for the housekeeper, remembered the tears and the screams in multiple languages. It was all so vivid that she couldn't lie to herself anymore. But out there, millions still debated endlessly, and Marissa had become the target of an unbalanced war. As for Marissa, she remained silent, choosing not to take part in the noisy back and forth, knowing one thing for certain: anything she said would be twisted and used against her. Still, her silence only fueled further speculation. Supporters saw it as pride, a refusal to play along with the circus of public outrage. Critics used it to claim she was avoiding the truth. No matter where she went, stares and whispers followed, turning daily life into a trap with no escape. From the housing block where she lived to the ordinary corners of the city, everyone knew her name, but not with pure respect, rather as the centerpiece of a loud, unresolved debate. Marissa had become the focus not in the way she wished, but through a storm of accusations, questions, and conflicting admiration. The public had not yet found an answer to the question, "Who's really lying?" But that very uncertainty had set the story ablaze, spreading like wildfire. And amidst the clashing opinions, the truth still hovered, waiting for another moment to erupt, forcing everyone to face it with no room left to deny. Clarissa returned to the Hale estate after the meeting in the housing block, with a completely different mindset. She no longer hid, no longer cloaked herself in vague statements to appease public opinion. The next morning, during a live interview on a major television network, Clarissa unexpectedly went public, openly criticizing the police officers who had been present at the party. In front of millions of viewers, she clearly stated that they had used their authority to smear Marissa, suppress the truth, and block a valuable study on language and autism. Her voice was steady, each word striking like an accusation, leaving the host speechless and the audience flooded with shock and outrage. No one expected a woman so discreet within high society to boldly speak out against the police force. Her declaration hit like a bomb, igniting a fierce wave of reaction. Headlines exploded across newspapers, social media lit up, and many who had once stayed silent now came forward in support. Even so, Clarissa knew that taking this public stance meant facing subtle but inevitable retaliation. But when she thought of Noah in Marissa's arms, when she remembered the boy's shining eyes in that modest apartment, she knew she had chosen the right path. Power, reputation, or wealth no longer mattered more than keeping the silent promise she had made to her son: never let his voice be buried again. At the same time, Clarissa sought out Marissa, this time not out of guilt or hesitation, but as a partner. The two sat together in the small apartment in the housing block, where light streamed in through the window onto the worn wooden table. Clarissa began, "We need to start from zero, and we'll do it together." Marissa was silent for a moment, her gaze searching, then she nodded. In her rare smile, there was both relief and resolve. In that moment, an alliance that once seemed impossible was forged: a wealthy heiress and a black housemaid, united by a shared belief in a child. Soon after, they began to act. In that very same housing block, where the walls peeled and hallways were narrow, a small language class was formed. There were no advanced tools, no vast financial backing, but the space pulsed with belief. Marissa taught directly, her eyes lighting up every time the children paid attention, while Clarissa used her network to quietly gather support from charitable organizations, helping to provide books, desks, and light for the classroom. On the first day of class, the children from the housing block sat crowded on plastic chairs, their eyes sparkling with excitement. Noah was there too, seated among his peers, clutching a notebook in his hands, his face glowing in a way that no longer resembled the autistic boy once labeled a monster. Clarissa stood at the back of the room, quietly observing, her lips curling into a faint smile. She had never imagined herself in such a modest setting, but now, it was this very place that made her feel she was finally doing something right. Marissa's voice rang out, guiding the children to pronounce each word. Clarissa listened, realizing that the voice no longer carried the hesitation of a maid, but the confidence of a leader. In her eyes, Marissa was no longer just a housekeeper, but a partner, an ally ready to walk beside her on a new journey. That makeshift classroom, with its cracked walls and crooked furniture, had become a symbol of a beginning. Outside, the public remained divided. The police still schemed to discredit them, but inside this tiny space, every word, every glance was a seed being planted. And in that moment, Clarissa understood she was no longer alone. This unlikely alliance, though fragile, was the true strength to resist the darkness closing in. In the days following the opening of the small classroom in the housing block, word spread quickly through parents and neighbors. At first, there were only a few local children, but soon, small groups from other neighborhoods began arriving, bringing their children, faces hesitant, eyes avoiding contact, hands trembling from the unfamiliar crowd. Marissa welcomed them all with a gentle smile, patiently sitting beside each one, slowly sparking curiosity with simple syllables, gradually building to short phrases in various languages. The initial awkwardness quickly faded as the cramped space filled with fragmented but eager voices, mixed with bursts of laughter when a child mispronounced a word and others gleefully repeated it. Clarissa often stood in the corner, watching it all unfold. She had never witnessed a scene that brought such peace to her heart, seeing children once dismissed by society, now rediscovering their voices with encouragement from those around them. Noah sat in the middle, becoming a bridge between classmates, eagerly guiding them through different languages, his eyes shining with confidence. His laughter blended with the others, spreading like a warm current that filled the tight room. Clarissa realized that this simple joy meant more than all the lavish parties she had ever attended, because it was honest, pure, and untouched by self-interest. The changes in the children began drawing attention from other parents. They started sharing their stories, saying their child, long silent, suddenly tried to say a new word, or that the one who used to hide in a corner now sat beside classmates. These word-of-mouth accounts spread quickly, and the small classroom soon overflowed, forcing Marissa to add more plastic chairs, while Clarissa reached out to a few charitable organizations for more books and teaching materials. The once cramped space now echoed with cheerful laughter, voices reading aloud in multiple languages, like a new song of hope. The press, which had once turned its back and clung to slanderous narratives, could no longer ignore the phenomenon. A group of reporters decided to visit the housing block, bringing cameras and lenses, initially hoping to dig up more material for negative coverage. But as they stepped into the cracked-walled room, they witnessed a scene too genuine to fabricate. Dozens of autistic children gathered together, eyes lighting up as they pronounced words, pure laughter ringing out, while Marissa and Clarissa stood patiently by their side, encouraging each child. What the cameras captured was not chaos, but a radiant truth no one could distort. The next day, many newspapers were forced to shift their tone. New headlines appeared on front pages: language classroom in housing block, where autistic children rediscover their voice. Photos of Noah standing among friends, smiling, with Marissa teaching beside him, spread across social media. Reader comments changed drastically, from skepticism to admiration, from attacks to support. Papers that once ignored the truth now had no choice but to face it, for if they didn't, they would be left behind by a rising tide of renewed public belief. Clarissa held the newspaper in her hands, her eyes stinging. She knew the road ahead remained long, and the forces they faced wouldn't give up easily. But at least now, the truth had found its place. Marissa was no longer a name mired in rumor, but a symbol of hope. And in the bursts of laughter from the children, Clarissa heard the affirmation that slander would slowly wash away, and only what is sincere would remain in people's hearts. One evening, just as the public had yet to settle after the recent news about the language class in the housing block, a major television network suddenly announced it would broadcast a live debate between the two sides. The studio was prepared like a battlefield, with dozens of cameras and lights focused directly on a round table where 4 chairs faced each other. Sloan and Briggs sat on the left, suits sharp but faces tense, eyes filled with both arrogance and anxiety. On the other side, Clarissa appeared in a rarely seen simple dress, her gaze resolute, and beside her was Marissa, face calm but hands lightly clenched, as if holding back a fire ready to erupt. The host spoke up, introducing each guest, then quickly cut to the central question. The public wants to know, what is the truth behind all this controversy? As soon as the mic turned their way, Sloan seized the moment. He painted himself as a defender of justice, insisting that he and his colleague only wanted to bring the facts to light. Briggs added that Marissa's teaching a class was dangerous, since she had no official credentials, and was merely exploiting children to boost her own image. Their words were sharp as blades, aimed to discredit their opponents, in front of millions of viewers. Meanwhile, Clarissa remained still, eyes locked on them, waiting for the mic to return her way. When her turn came, Clarissa didn't dodge, nor did she mince words. She looked straight into the camera, eyes burning as if piercing through the screen into each viewer's living room, and said firmly, "You are more afraid of a child than you are of yourselves." The sentence echoed, crisp and clear, freezing the entire studio. Sloan flinched slightly, Briggs scowled, and the online audience erupted into immediate chatter. That statement wasn't just an accusation, but an unmasking, striking the deepest weakness of men used to hiding behind power to silence others. Marissa was then invited to speak. She recounted Noah's journey, from the early days, when he sat silent, to the moment he began articulating sounds clearly, and then mastering multiple languages. Her voice wasn't loud or dramatic, but the truth in each word drew the studio into complete stillness. The camera panned to Clarissa, the once proud mother now letting honesty guide her tone. She spoke of the first time she heard her son's voice, of the regret for doubting him, and the gratitude she held for Marissa, the woman who had believed when everyone else turned away. Sloan and Briggs tried to interject, repeatedly denying the accusations, but their words began to sound out of place. The more they spoke, the more they revealed their unease, as images from the small classroom already broadcast lingered vividly in the audience's minds. The children's laughter, the clips of Noah studying with his classmates, all served as undeniable proof. The camera caught the moment. Sloan furrowed his brows, sweat forming on his forehead, while Briggs forced a stiff, uneasy smile. The program reached its peak of tension when the host posed a direct question. If Noah was simply the victim of a staged act, then how could he speak 9 languages in front of hundreds of witnesses? The question struck like a blade, slicing the air with a heavy silence. Sloan stammered. Briggs looked down at his notes, while Clarissa sat upright, eyes shining, and Marissa remained silent with pride. It was the silence of someone holding the truth, needing no further defense. As the show ended, social media exploded, and the clip of Clarissa pointing at the 2 officers and saying, "You are more afraid of a child than you are of yourselves," became the most shared quote. Public opinion quickly shifted in favor of her and Marissa, while Sloan and Briggs fell into a defensive position, their images now tied to deceit and cowardice. That televised confrontation marked a crucial turning point. From that moment, the scales of justice began to tip toward those once considered powerless, and the truth started to break through the veil of lies. Just when the show seemed to be wrapping up, Marissa unexpectedly asked for more time to speak. The studio fell silent. The host hesitated briefly, then nodded in approval. Marissa stood slowly, her hands steady and firm, pulling from her bag a stack of old documents bound in yellowed covers. The studio lights reflected off the pages, casting a shimmering glow that stood out amid the sea of camera lenses. She looked directly at Sloan and Briggs, her voice low but resolute. "This is the research I submitted years ago, about the connection between language and the autistic brain. It was blocked not because it lacked scientific merit, but because certain powers didn't want a poor black woman to have a voice in academia." The studio erupted at once. Chairs shifted, voices murmured urgently throughout the room. The camera zoomed in on Marissa's face, where her eyes burned with pride layered over years of pain. She opened the pages, revealing charts, data, and evidence under the camera's gaze, scientifically proving that the linguistic memory of autistic children could function differently, with an extraordinary capacity to absorb and reproduce sound. It wasn't just theory. Her research included observation logs, experimental records, and even endorsements from professors who had once read it but were pressured to withdraw their signatures. Each piece of evidence she presented sliced through the wall of deception, leaving Sloan and Briggs frozen in place. Clarissa sat beside her, eyes reddened, her hand unconsciously clenched into a fist as she looked at those pages. She knew this was not a simple defense, but a truth long buried. Everyone in the studio could feel it too, because no one could fabricate such an extensive dossier. No one could fake every detailed annotation with a half-hearted motive. The flashes from photographers' cameras burst continuously, eager to capture every expression, every document laid bare. The host, who had remained neutral from the start, could no longer hide his shock. His voice turned hoarse as he asked, "If what you're saying is true, then who blocked this research?" The question landed squarely on Sloan and Briggs, leaving them flustered, sweat beading on their foreheads. Briggs forced a stiff smile, lips tightly pressed, while Sloan avoided eye contact, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. They could neither deny nor explain, because the audience had already seen the evidence with their own eyes. At that moment, the entire studio fell into a tense silence. Everyone held their breath, as if waiting for a confession or a turning point to unfold. The silence was heavier than any accusation, because it clearly revealed the fact that the accused had nothing left to counter. Clarissa turned her head toward Marissa, admiration shining in her eyes, for the woman once humiliated was now standing tall, striking back with knowledge and truth. A wave of applause rose from the audience, hesitant at first, then building, finally swelling into thunderous clapping. The host nodded repeatedly, his voice echoing that this was a historic turning point. On the live broadcast, millions of viewers witnessed the unimaginable. A woman once called a maid had become the central figure, tearing down a wall of lies with the very research that had once been suppressed. And at that very moment, without any further defense, the truth alone was powerful enough to leave the entire studio stunned and breathless before erupting into a roar. After Clarissa revealed the blocked research, the atmosphere in the studio was already at its peak, but the real surprise had yet to arrive. Clarissa, who had remained silently observant since the debate began, suddenly leaned down and pulled from her leather briefcase a thick envelope, carefully sealed. She placed it on the table, eyes fixed straight at the camera and the officers across from her, her voice ringing out without hesitation. "The truth doesn't end with the research. These are documents proving that you were paid to reject Marissa's work." The words struck like lightning, freezing the entire studio. The cameras immediately zoomed in, capturing every detail of the pages inside the envelope, clearly showing signatures, stamps, and suspicious financial transactions. The audience erupted in gasps and murmurs, and a few even shouted out loud in shock. The host looked stunned, but quickly instructed the camera crew to zoom in so the television audience could also see the evidence. Clarissa turned each page, reading aloud the transactions, showing money transferred to the accounts of several senior officers, including the names Sloan and Briggs. She spoke each word like a blade. "You didn't just slander a woman, you sold out justice to protect your own rotten power and prejudice." The accusation echoed throughout the studio, thickening the air with tension. Sloan sat frozen, his hand twitching, trying to force a smile, but his face contorted, sweat streaming down his forehead. Briggs flushed red, attempting to respond, but his voice came out hoarse, barely audible. Marissa stood beside Clarissa, her eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. She never imagined the woman who once turned her back would now risk everything to bring the truth to light. Clarissa turned to her, their eyes met, and a subtle nod between them confirmed that from now on, they were truly on the same side. In the control room, the director signaled to display digitized versions of the documents on the large screen for the whole country to see. Instantly, social media exploded, and comments flooded in. Hashtags calling for an investigation into the police force spread rapidly, and the show's live viewership surged by the minute. The public no longer questioned whether Marissa had exploited Noah, but instead focused directly on a new question: who bribed the police? Who was protecting them? The pressure of public opinion shifted entirely, targeting Sloan and Briggs, turning them from accusers into hunted men. Clarissa continued speaking, her voice not loud but so clear no one could ignore it. "I once believed I had to bow my head to preserve the family's honor, but the truth is different. Honor cannot survive if we let others distort it with money and power. This is the evidence, and I'm ready to hand it over to the court, so that my son and all other children won't be crushed by lies anymore." She held the folder high, the spotlight shining down, her face radiant, a stark contrast to the woman who once fumbled under public pressure. The entire studio erupted in that moment. Thunderous applause broke out, and the audience leapt to their feet, many cheering Noah's and Marissa's names. No one paid attention to the awkwardness of the two officers anymore, because they understood the act was over and the truth had finally been revealed. Clarissa set the folder down on the table, her hands trembling, but her eyes glowing with conviction. She knew that from this moment on, a major legal battle would begin, but at least, the door to truth had opened, and no force could shut it again. Right after the live broadcast, the evidence Clarissa revealed ignited a wave of public outrage like never before. Social media was flooded with images and quotes, especially the moment she pointed at the two officers and held up the folder exposing illicit payments. Thousands of posts, millions of comments poured in. No one cared about the old accusations anymore. All focus shifted to the question, who allowed them to sell out justice? The fury spread fast, from online discussions to actions on the streets. Spontaneous protests broke out across multiple areas, with citizens carrying signs, chanting for transparency and justice. Crowds filled the roads, footsteps pounding alongside chants rising like a tidal wave, unstoppable. The media dropped its neutral tone, with front pages filled with images of protests, rows of people raising banners demanding an investigation into the police force. News channels ran non-stop footage of packed city squares, children and the elderly included, not shouting in rage but raising steady voices of resistance. The atmosphere shook the entire society. Even those who had stayed silent felt compelled to rise because the truth was now too clear. Any defense of Sloan and Briggs was now fuel to the fire every time they spoke. Public anger only intensified. Meanwhile, Clarissa chose to remain silent, no longer appearing in the media as often as before. Instead, images of her and Marissa continuing to work in the small classroom in the housing complex spread widely, standing in contrast to the chaos outside. This only strengthened public belief that they stood on the side of truth, and all hope began to center around the boy, Noah, now seen as the symbol of a voice that could not be buried. People brought Noah's photo to marches, holding up the image of him smiling, treating it like a flag that affirmed hope. Under increasing public pressure, the authorities could no longer offer protection. An urgent announcement aired on national television. Sloan and Briggs were officially suspended, pending investigation. The news immediately set off an eruption in the crowds, cheers like thunder filling the air, and many people hugging each other in joy. This wasn't just a downfall for the two officers, but a turning point, showing that public will was powerful enough to shake even the walls of power once thought untouchable. Independent investigators were assigned, and the files detailing illicit transactions were examined closely. Every figure aligned perfectly with the evidence Clarissa had revealed, making denial almost impossible. In the media, politicians were forced to respond. Some expressed shame for having once believed the false accusations, while others seized the moment to declare their support for police reform. The city felt as if it had awakened, a veil of lies torn apart, and the light of truth now pouring into every corner. Sloan and Briggs, once arrogant figures before the cameras, had become targets of public scrutiny. They now avoided the spotlight, unable to face the public, their faces gaunt and tense each time they appeared. Television aired footage of them entering the investigation headquarters, no longer met with applause or respect, only mocking whistles and scornful stares. The entire society followed the investigation closely, unwilling to let darkness return. And amid this charged landscape, Clarissa, Marissa, and Noah quietly continued their path, proving that a true voice could light up a city searching for justice. After weeks of intense scrutiny, the final results of the investigation were announced. Irrefutable evidence from financial records, witness testimonies, and the long-buried research manuscript brought everything into the light. On national television, officials declared that Marissa was completely innocent, with no indication that she had exploited Noah as previously smeared. On the contrary, she was hailed as a pioneer, someone who had opened a new path in the study of extraordinary language abilities in autistic children. The name Marissa Carter echoed everywhere, no longer attached to the belittling term maid, but honored as a symbol of resilience and intellect. A prestigious university extended an invitation for her to become an honorary lecturer, offering her an official role in teaching and research, a chance that had once been stolen by injustice. Standing at the lectern on her first day in her new role, her eyes shimmered, and her hands trembled not from fear, but from emotion. Clarissa sat in the front row, her eyes brimming with tears as she watched the woman be welcomed by a standing ovation. She knew that without Marissa's unwavering belief, without her courage to expose the truth, neither she nor Noah would have reached this day. Amid the thunderous applause, Clarissa turned to her son, gently took his hand, and whispered a reminder. "We found justice, and you showed the world something miraculous." Noah sat beside his mother, his face radiant, his eyes gleaming with a joy few had ever seen before. He no longer hid in the shadows, no longer drifted in silence. Patience and belief had brought him into the light, and now that light shone brighter than ever, with the announcement of a special scholarship fund for gifted autistic children, Noah being the first recipient. The certificate was presented amid roaring applause. He bowed his head to receive it, his hands slightly trembling, but his smile whole and sure. It was not just a reward for his talent, but a confirmation that his voice had been heard and accepted by society. News spread across the city and the entire country, becoming a story of inspiration. The media covered it widely, no longer with sensationalism but with respect. They wrote about a boy once called a monster who had become a symbol of hope, about a black woman once scorned who had become an honorary lecturer, and about a wealthy mother who chose to abandon silence and stand against injustice. Each figure bore their own wounds, but those very wounds had become the source of their strength to create change. In the small classroom in the housing complex, now renovated and more spacious thanks to support from several organizations, laughter still echoed. Other autistic children came seeking the chance to be encouraged to speak in their own way. Marissa, now officially a lecturer, continued to return here whenever she could, believing that real change began with the smallest steps. Clarissa remained by her side, and Noah, now with his scholarship in hand, had become a role model for other children to believe they could succeed, too. This victory was not just a legal outcome, but a confirmation of a deeper truth. Once illuminated, the truth has the power to wash away all lies. Clarissa, Marissa, and Noah had stepped out of the shadows, carrying with them a new kind of hope for thousands of once hopeless families. And from here on, their story was no longer a tragedy, but a triumphant anthem, where victory did not come from power, but from the unwavering voices of those who dared to believe in what was right. At a nationally televised press conference packed with reporters and flashing cameras, Clarissa stepped up to the podium with a solemn expression. She wore simple clothes, stripped of the usual glamour, gripping a sheet of notes in her hands, but when the microphone lit up, she didn't look down. Her voice rang out, slow but steady, as if she wanted each word to settle deep into the hearts of those listening. I was wrong to stay silent, wrong to let prejudice and pressure force a woman like Marissa to leave my house in shame. I bow my head to apologize to her, and more importantly, to my son, for not standing by him from the beginning. Her words echoed, and the entire room held its breath. In that moment, the woman once known for her pride and poise stripped all that away, not a powerful millionaire anymore, but a mother owning her mistake in front of the world. Applause broke from the rows below, slowly building until the whole room erupted. Some reporters lowered their cameras, overwhelmed with emotion. On social media, a short clip of the speech, just a few seconds long, immediately went viral, with millions of shares and comments praising Clarissa's courage. People didn't see a wealthy heiress, they saw a woman brave enough to admit her fault in defense of the truth. Her apology not only bridged the distance between her and Maris, but also became a reflection for many parents who had once refused to hear their own children's voices. Immediately after, it was the police department's turn to step up to the microphone. Sloan and Briggs were absent, still under suspension and awaiting a final conclusion, but another high-ranking officer stood in their place, his expression solemn. Before hundreds of cameras, he bowed his head for a long moment before speaking. We offer our apology to the public for allowing corrupted individuals to stain the honor of the force. We apologize to the Hale family, to Miss Marissa Carter, and especially to young Noah. Children should have been protected, not turned into targets for defamation. The air fell still for a beat, then erupted in thunderous applause, not as an immediate act of forgiveness, but because the public had finally heard an official acknowledgement from those once atop the chain of power. News outlets swiftly released reports. Bold headlines splashed across front pages. Police publicly admit fault. The story was no longer distorted into a farce, but recognized as a turning point where justice began to be restored. Clips of Clarissa bowing her head and the officer's formal admission were widely shared, even reaching other countries. International forums covered it as a textbook example of how the voice of the public can compel systemic change. Marissa watched the broadcast from her small apartment, her eyes glowing with emotion. After years of being dismissed and blocked from academia, the truth had finally prevailed. Noah sat beside her, clutching his notebook, his eyes gleaming as he heard his name mentioned in the official apology. He didn't fully understand the weight of those statements, but he could sense people now looked at him differently, not with pity, but with respect. After the press conference, Clarissa returned home and sought out Marissa, offering no grand words, just a firm, silent handshake that said everything. This victory was more than just clearing one person's name, it served as a wake-up call to society. When Clarissa bowed her head, when the police admitted their wrongdoing, thousands of families with autistic children felt like their voices had finally been heard. Old wounds could not be erased in a single day, but at the very least, a new door had been opened, where trust could begin to grow from what was genuine. After the days when Clarissa bowed her head in apology and the police were forced to publicly admit their wrongdoing, society could not return to what it once was. From the story of Noah and Marissa, a new movement began to form initially, just scattered posts online, but it quickly became a fire spreading across the city and the entire country. People gave it a simple yet powerful name, Voice of Autism. This hashtag flooded every platform, in every post, every photo, every video. C. Capturing the voices of children who had long been seen as silent. The image of Noah in class, his eyes glowing as he spoke, became the movement's emblem, a reminder that every voice deserves to be heard. Immediately, countless families with autistic children began to speak up. They shared short clips of the first time their child uttered a new word, photos of children smiling when someone finally listened, long stories about the pain of exclusion and the joy of being acknowledged. These posts received tens of thousands of shares, forming a powerful wave of empathy. People realized that behind each child was a hard-fought journey, and every family had battled silently for years. Now, through Noah's story, they found the courage to stop hiding, to transform personal voices into collective strength. International media quickly took notice. Major news networks reported on Voice of Autism as a significant social phenomenon, calling it proof that what seems small can shake entire systems. Reporters visited the housing complex, filming the small classroom where Marissa and Clarissa continued to teach. Footage of children laughing in the cramped but bright room spread worldwide, turning the movement from a local spark into a global call for attention. Clarissa, who once bowed her head in regret, now stood on international forums, urging educational and healthcare organizations to collaborate on building support programs for autistic children. She no longer spoke with the tone of a businesswoman, but with the heart of a mother who had known pain, with a spirit that had learned humility. Marissa was invited to multiple conferences to present her research, yet she kept returning to the small classroom, knowing it was the origin of all belief. And Noah, with his special scholarship, became the movement's symbol, his smile featured in awareness campaigns, carrying the message that every voice matters. All over, community support groups were formed, and parents were no longer afraid to speak about their children. They organized gatherings where autistic kids could learn together, play together, and most importantly, be heard without judgment. From there, change began to seep into every corner, gradually shaking old prejudices. Laughter from these children could now be heard not only in Marissa's classroom but also in parks, schools, and places that once had tightly shut doors. The Voice of Autism movement was no longer just a story of one family or one city, it became an echo for all of society. It made people pause and ask themselves how many times they had ignored a voice simply because it was different. And from those questions, a new belief was born, that justice doesn't only exist in courtrooms, but begins with listening to what once seemed insignificant. Noah, Marissa, and Clarissa sparked the flame, but now it belonged to everyone, lighting the path for thousands of families who had lived in silence, proving that every voice raised could become a symbol of hope. After the Voice of Autism movement exploded with overwhelming support, Marissa decided to turn that belief into concrete action. She didn't choose the path of fame at prestigious universities, despite receiving many offers, but focused instead on her long-held dream, to open a free language center for autistic children. In an old building renovated with help from benefactors, a modest sign reading Freedom Language Center was hung, marking a new beginning. There were no tuition fees, no discrimination based on background. Any family with a child in need was welcome. On opening day, dozens of parents arrived hand in hand with their children. Many moved to tears at the sight of a well-lit room, filled with books, learning tools, and Marissa's gentle smile. The atmosphere overflowed with hope, like the opening notes of a new journey. Noah, beaming, also took part in the opening. He was not just a symbol anymore but had become a companion to his peers. He sat among the children, leading small games, encouraging others to pronounce words, to share the vocabulary they had learned. Clarissa stood in the back, quietly observing, her heart full of pride as she watched her son no longer confined by silence, but growing into a source of confidence for others. From a boy once labeled different, Noah had stepped fully into the light, continuing to inspire right within the center that Marissa had built with all her heart. The media covered the event extensively. International outlets called it a lighthouse for forgotten voices, while local residents regarded the center as a shared home. Photos of Marissa leaning down to teach, Clarissa quietly organizing materials, and Noah smiling among friends spread across headlines. Every compliment, every shared story, turned the modest center into a symbol of hope that stretched far beyond the borders of a single city. Meanwhile, on another front, justice also began taking slow but steady steps. Independent investigations gained momentum, bringing to light a trail of shady dealings, illicit funds, and abuses of power by Sloan, Briggs, and their associates. On the first day of trial, a sea of people gathered outside the courthouse, holding banners demanding a fair hearing. Faces that once shouted in protest now stood in order, their eyes lit with the belief that darkness would finally be held accountable. News outlets broadcast images of the two officers being escorted into the courtroom, no longer the commanding figures they once were, but hunched silhouettes with hollowed faces and averted eyes. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn. The prosecutor clearly read out each piece of evidence, revisiting the financial records, the rejected research, and consistent testimonies from multiple witnesses. Every detail echoed like a reckoning, triggering cheers from the crowd outside, as each word reaffirmed truths long buried. Clarissa and Marissa didn't attend to witness their enemy's fall, but to affirm that the path they had walked wasn't in vain. They sat quietly among the spectators, eyes fixed ahead, as if to say this was only the beginning of justice. When the judge struck the gavel, declaring the trial would proceed against all involved in the abuse of power, the courtroom erupted in applause. Outside, thousands chanted slogans, not out of anger, but with unshakable belief in change. And in that moment, the humble language center and the monumental courtroom seemed to merge into one planting seeds for the future, the other sweeping away remnants of the past. These two currents converged, proving that when justice and compassion meet, they forge a victory stronger than any force that once stood against them. After the whirlwind of events, Clarissa sat alone in her spacious office, where walls lined with awards and million-dollar contracts had once been her pride. She gazed quietly out the glass window, city lights reflecting back at her heart empty. Years of relentless battles in the business world had once made her feel invincible, but now, the greatest value in her life no longer lay in numbers or deals, but in Noah's smile and voice. One morning, she walked into a boardroom filled with shareholders and announced she would officially step down from her executive role. The room stirred with whispers, but Clarissa remained firm, her voice steady. "I choose to spend the rest of my life being a mother, walking beside my son." With that, she signed the resignation papers, placing a period on a chapter of power that had held her captive for too long. Leaving the business world behind, Clarissa returned to a role she had once forgotten. Every morning, she took Noah to the center, sitting in on sessions, listening closely to each word he spoke. She no longer chased packed travel schedules or obsessed over stock prices, but found joy sitting on a worn plastic chair, watching her son beam with his friends. One day, Noah tugged her sleeve, pointing to the colorful books on the shelf, his eyes wide with excitement. Clarissa laughed, realizing that in her child's laughter, she had found a peace no empire could ever give. Meanwhile, Marissa continued to lead the language center, though it had grown far beyond a small classroom. With community support and international funding, the center was upgraded into a full research institute, where experts in language, psychology, and education collaborated. Marissa held the position of research director, a title once unjustly taken from her, now rightfully returned through public recognition. Under her leadership, projects on auditory memory and multi-layered language ability in autistic children were launched, drawing attention from scholars around the world. Each published report stood not just as a personal achievement, but as proof that the voices once deemed silent had become subjects of global academic value. Clarissa and Marissa, once women on opposite ends, had now become allies. There were no more roles of employer and servant, no more lines drawn by race or class, only a shared mission, to protect and empower forgotten voices. Many times, as Clarissa watched Marissa speak to panels of scientists, she applauded with pride, as if clapping for the path that had brought them together. Noah always sat in the front row, eyes shining, a living testament to all their efforts. The center continued to grow, attracting not only local children but also families from far away. In every laugh, in every new word spoken by the children, Marissa saw the purpose she had devoted her life to, while Clarissa found redemption for past mistakes. This new journey was no longer a solitary fight, but a wide-open path, where they walked together, carrying the belief that truth and compassion could transform an entire generation. Noah's name was no longer confined to a single movement but gradually became a symbol of cultural connection. The image of the boy, once cast aside from the normal world, now standing in international halls, confidently speaking in multiple languages, moved people to silence. In widely shared videos, Noah could shift from English to Japanese, from French to Arabic effortlessly, as if he were an invisible bridge between civilizations. Schools began inviting him to join exchange events, so children everywhere could see that difference is not a barrier, but a key to unlock the world. Many journalists called Noah the boy with 9 voices, seeing him as living proof of humanity's ability to connect through the language of the heart. Clarissa, who once hid her son from judgmental stares, now traveled with him on every trip, her face full of pride. Each time Noah stood on stage, eyes glowing with excitement, she felt her old regrets slowly heal. Marissa stood behind the scenes, her gentle smile unchanged, one hand lightly gripping a stack of documents, quietly observing. To her, watching Noah shine wasn't just a teaching achievement, but a reward for patience and trust placed in the right place. And both women, though they came from different worlds, now stood united, seeing Noah as a small ambassador carrying a message of hope to humanity. That growing influence led to a major turning point, an international conference on language and special education held in Geneva, where the names Clarissa Hale, Marissa Carter, and Noah Hale were honored together during the opening session. The hall was packed with scholars, experts, and journalists, bright lights flooding the stage as the three stepped forward. Marissa was introduced as a pioneer in researching the link between language and autism. Clarissa was cited as a model parent who broke through prejudice to stand with the truth. And Noah was celebrated as a symbol of strength beyond limits. As the three stood side by side, the applause lasted endlessly, with many in the audience moved to tears. In her speech, Marissa shared the journey from being silenced and defamed to standing here today, affirming that knowledge and belief can be delayed, but never extinguished. Clarissa followed, her voice trembling but firm, emphasizing that the greatest lesson she had learned was the importance of listening, of placing people above power and self-interest. Finally, Noah, with Marissa's help, stepped up to the microphone and spoke each sentence in different languages. "We are different, but we all have a voice." The entire hall rose to its feet, applause erupting like a downpour, drowning out all the noise of the past. The event was quickly reported everywhere, becoming a milestone for both the scientific and social communities. International media praised it as a victory not just for one family, but for all children who had once been forgotten. From that point on, educational organizations began developing more support programs, inspired by Marissa's Language Center. Clarissa, Marissa, and Noah were not only honored in that grand hall, but their names became part of a larger movement, where truth, compassion, and belief came together, opening a new path for countless families in search of hope. After the whirlwind of events, Clarissa sat alone in her spacious office, where walls lined with awards and million-dollar contracts had once been her pride. She gazed quietly out the glass window, city lights reflecting back at her, her heart empty. Years of relentless battles in the business world had once made her feel invincible, but now, the greatest value in her life no longer lay in numbers or deals, but in Noah's smile and voice. One morning, she walked into a boardroom filled with shareholders and announced she would officially step down from her executive role. The room stirred with whispers, but Clarissa remained firm, her voice steady. "I choose to spend the rest of my life being a mother, walking beside my son." With that, she signed the resignation papers, placing a period on a chapter of power that had held her captive for too long. Leaving the business world behind, Clarissa returned to a role she had once forgotten. Every morning, she took Noah to the center, sitting in on sessions, listening closely to each word he spoke. She no longer chased packed travel schedules or obsessed over stock prices, but found joy sitting on a worn plastic chair, watching her son beam with his friends. One day, Noah tugged her sleeve, pointing to the colorful books on the shelf, his eyes wide with excitement. Clarissa laughed, realizing that in her child's laughter, she had found a peace no empire could ever give. Meanwhile, Marissa continued to lead the Language Center, though it had grown far beyond a small classroom. With community support and international funding, the center was upgraded into a full research institute, where experts in language, psychology, and education collaborated. Marissa held the position of research director, a title once unjustly taken from her, now rightfully returned through public recognition. Under her leadership, projects on auditory memory and multi-layered language ability in autistic children were launched, drawing attention from scholars around the world. Each published report stood not just as a personal achievement, but as proof that the voices once deemed silent had become subjects of global academic value. Clarissa and Marissa, once women on opposite ends, had now become allies. There were no more roles of employer and servant, no more lines drawn by race or class, only a shared mission, to protect and empower forgotten voices. Many times, as Clarissa watched Marissa speak to panels of scientists, she applauded with pride, as if clapping for the path that had brought them together. Noah always sat in the front row, eyes shining, a living testament to all their efforts. The center continued to grow, attracting not only local children but also families from far away. In every laugh, in every new word spoken by the children, Marissa saw the purpose she had devoted her life to, while Clarissa found redemption for past mistakes. This new journey was no longer a solitary fight, but a wide-open path, where they walked together, carrying the belief that truth and compassion could transform an entire generation. Noah's name was no longer confined to a single movement, but gradually became a symbol of cultural connection. The image of the bow, once cast aside from the normal world, now standing in international halls, confidently speaking in multiple languages, moved people to silence. In widely shared videos, Noah could shift from English to Japanese, from French to Arabic, effortlessly, as if he were an invisible bridge between civilizations. Schools began inviting him to join exchange events, so children everywhere could see that difference is not a barrier, but a key to unlock the world. Many journalists called Noah the boy with 9 voices, seeing him as living proof of humanity's ability to connect through the language of the heart. Clarissa, who once hid her son from judgmental stares, now traveled with him on every trip, her face full of pride. Each time Noah stood on stage, eyes glowing with excitement, she felt her old regrets slowly heal. Marissa stood behind the scenes, her gentle smile unchanged, one hand lightly gripping a stack of documents, quietly observing. To her, watching Noah shine wasn't just a teaching achievement, but a reward for patience and trust placed in the right place. And both women, though they came from different worlds, now stood united, seeing Noah as a small ambassador carrying a message of hope to humanity. That growing influence led to a major turning point. An international conference on language and special education held in Geneva, where the names Clarissa Hale, Marissa Carter, and Noah Hale were honored together during the opening session. The hall was packed with scholars, experts, and journalists, bright lights flooding the stage as the three stepped forward. Marissa was introduced as a pioneer in researching the link between language and autism. Clarissa was cited as a model parent who broke through prejudice to stand with the truth, and Noah was celebrated as a symbol of strength beyond limits. As the three stood side by side, the applause lasted endlessly, with many in the audience moved to tears. In her speech, Marissa shared the journey from being silenced and defamed to standing here today, affirming that knowledge and belief can be delayed but never extinguished. Clarissa followed, her voice trembling but firm, emphasizing that the greatest lesson she had learned was the importance of listening, of placing people above power and self-interest. Finally, Noah, with Marissa's help, stepped up to the microphone and spoke each sentence in different languages. We are different, but we all have a voice. The entire hall rose to its feet, applause erupting like a downpour, drowning out all the noise of the past. The event was quickly reported everywhere, becoming a milestone for both the scientific and social communities. International media praised it as a victory not just for one family, but for all children who had once been forgotten. From that point on, educational organizations began developing more support programs, inspired by Marissa's Language Center. Clarissa, Marissa, and Noah were not only honored in that grand hall, but their names became part of a larger movement, where truth, compassion, and belief came together, opening a new path for countless families in search of hope. The International Hall that day was brightly lit, with thousands of delegates from around the world filling every seat, the atmosphere solemn yet full of anticipation. On stage, Noah stepped out in a simple suit, his eyes shimmering under the lights, showing none of the hesitation often seen in a child once labeled as different. When the microphone was placed in front of him, Noah smiled and began to speak, not in just one language, but seamlessly translating into several. He started in English, moved fluidly into Spanish, then French, followed by Japanese, German, Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian. Each language poured out clearly and precisely, making the entire hall hold its breath. People no longer saw an autistic boy, but a small genius, building a bridge for the entire world. Applause rang out from many corners, but Noah kept going, as if determined to prove that his voice could shatter every barrier. Clarissa sat in the front row, her heart pounding, eyes brimming with tears as she watched her son stand tall before thousands. So many years of feeling lost, so many moments of regret, now seemed to lead to this moment. When the microphone came her way, Clarissa stood up, her voice echoing, trembling but firm. My son doesn't need pity, only opportunity. The words struck like an arrow straight to the hearts of everyone listening, not flowery, but powerful enough to move the entire room. It wasn't just about Noah, but a message to every child who had ever been cast aside, that they do not need false sympathy, but trust and a path to walk. Applause erupted like a wave, rising and swelling, with many people standing, eyes wet with emotion. Marissa was invited to speak as well, but she didn't need grand statements. She simply bowed, her gentle eyes turning to Clarissa and Noah, then quietly said, "That opportunity is the voice we must never ignore." Simple, yet the room fell silent before bursting again into applause. The presence of those three on stage, a mother who had made mistakes but chose to make them right, a black woman once scorned who had become a guiding light, and a boy who had once been silent but now spoke for the whole world, formed a complete picture of the strength found in patience and belief. Reporters jostled to capture every moment, Noah translating multiple languages in real time, Clarissa declaring her emotional statement, and Marissa's unwavering gaze, all of it quickly broadcast around the globe. Within hours, social media was flooded with clips, millions of shares accompanied by messages brimming with hope. Comments from parents of autistic children appeared everywhere. "We'll give our child a chance too. This story makes me believe tomorrow will be different." The event in that international hall was not just a conference, but a historical milestone, when the story of a boy, a mother, and a steadfast woman led the world to recognize the voices once forgotten. As the program concluded, applause still echoed throughout the hall. Noah held hands with his mother and Marissa, the three of them bowing together under the spotlight, which fell like the final beam of light on a long journey. That night, international news called it a moment never to forget, and many declared it a victory not just for one family, but for justice, for belief, and for millions of voices that had never been heard. And from that moment on, the story no longer ended with Noah, Clarissa, or Marissa, it became a flame of inspiration for the world, so that any child might be given the chance to raise their own voice. Just as the conference seemed to end, the host unexpectedly invited Marissa to share one final remark. She stepped onto the podium, her eyes scanning the hall where thousands of faces looked on. The spotlight fell on her slight frame, making it stand out more than any lavish attire ever could. Marissa carried no notes, nor did she need any rehearsed lines. She took a deep breath, then spoke in a warm, steady voice that carried strength. Language doesn't care about skin color, only about a heart willing to listen. The hall held its breath as that simple sentence struck directly at the roots of all prejudice. It wasn't just about language, it was about how people treat one another, how society chooses to hear or ignore the voices of the vulnerable. In the front row, Clarissa brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. She recalled the time she had once looked at Marissa with suspicion, doubting her bond with Noah. Now, hearing those words, Clarissa felt a cleansing within herself, as if the imprints of old prejudice were dissolving. She turned to her son and saw Noah nodding, as though he, too, understood that someone had just voiced his unspoken faith. The air in the hall stretched taut for a few seconds, then erupted into thunderous applause. Many cried, many stood, because they knew that sentence would be repeated for years to come, as a declaration of justice and compassion. Marissa stepped back, eyes shining, as the microphone shifted toward the host. But before the program officially concluded, the organizers took a moment to read a closing message. The large screen behind them lit up, words appearing in bold as a voice echoed throughout the hall. Justice is not the privilege of the powerful, but the voice given to those once deemed voiceless. The room fell silent, no clicking cameras, no murmurs, only a solemn stillness, like a vow. That message was the final touch, freezing even the hearts long accustomed to indifference. It served as a reminder that the right to be heard does not belong to those in power, but is an inherent right of every human being, including those who had once been denied it. In the audience, many scientists, politicians, and parents of autistic children rose to their feet, eyes lit with shared conviction. They did not erupt into applause immediately, instead allowing a few seconds of silence to absorb the meaning of the message. Then, unexpectedly, one pair of hands clapped, followed by a second, then a third, and within moments, the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause, so powerful, it felt as if the ground was shaking. Clarissa embraced Noah, whispering, "You did it, my son. Your voice moved the world." The story closed in the light of an international auditorium, where Noah's voice, echoing in many languages, had become a symbol of truth and hope. From beginnings steeped in the shadows of prejudice, where a boy was seen with pity and a black woman was dismissed in her own profession, the journey transformed into a heroic anthem of courage and belief. Clarissa, once a powerful millionaire concerned only with profit and prestige, had learned to shed her aura and become a true mother, one who could admit her mistakes and stand up for her child. Marissa, once a maligned housekeeper, proved through intellect and patience that human worth does not depend on skin color or social status, but on the perseverance to pursue one's convictions. And Noah, the child once trapped in silence, rose to become a voice that touched millions of hearts, a testament that even the most fragile-seeming things can change the world. That journey had led to major turning points, not just in the lives of 3 individuals but across a broader society. The Free Language Center, led by Marissa, had become a gathering place for children once forgotten, where laughter and confidence gradually replaced silence and fear. Clarissa stepped away from the corporate world to devote herself fully to Noah, rediscovering a simple happiness she once lost. Together, they stood by Marissa, not divided by status, but united in building a new path, planting trust in the community, and storing hope for families of autistic children. From there, the Voice of Autism movement expanded, becoming an unstoppable force that brought change to policies, public discourse, and, most importantly, to the hearts of people. What made this story truly inspiring wasn't the legal victories or shifts in public opinion, but the quiet transformations within each character. Clarissa learned that power and wealth could never replace a mother's presence, that the greatest courage isn't found at the top, but in bowing one's head to make things right. Marissa proved that even when crushed by injustice, a person can rise, using knowledge and compassion to pave the way for truth. And Noah, with innocence and a rare gift, gave the world a simple lesson. Justice does not come from the strong, but from the honest voices of those once denied. Looking back, the entire journey resembled a mirror reflecting the raw truths of society, where power can bury the weak, but also where faith and courage can make a system bend. The story serves as a reminder that what we disregard today may become the light of tomorrow, that everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth. Amid the long applause and tear-filled eyes of thousands in the international audience, that message became clearer than ever. The lesson left after everything is that every person has a voice, and that voice must be heard with the heart. Languages may differ, cultures may vary, but truth and compassion come from the same source. Justice is not a gift granted by the powerful, but the result of those who dare to stand and never give up. Clarissa, Marissa, and Noah proved this with their lives, leaving the world with a flame that will never fade. And when the final round of applause came to a close, it was clear that this story would not just live in memory but continue to inspire thousands, even millions, of other journeys waiting to be lit. Marissa stood beside them, eyes shimmering, her smile full of belief. That night, media outlets everywhere published images and echoed the message just spoken, calling it the perfect conclusion to a journey full of struggle but radiant with meaning. News stories described it not simply as a conference, but as a historic milestone where an autistic boy, a mother who once lost her way, and a black woman who had been looked down on together changed the way the world sees justice. And from that final message, a new belief spread. Justice was no longer something distant, but something found in every person's voice, especially in those once silenced but now rising strong.